that a month away, you know, give you time to kind of think and reread and all of that. You know, the first 38 sections thereabouts, or you know, chapters 1 through 6 of Division 1. Then we go on to, yeah, and then we'll go to the section on care, 41 and 42 only, right? And then after 41 and 42, and I'll send out an email, I thought about this last night, we'll go to the chapter 6 on time, and we'll see the shaking of the vulgar concept of time, and then read it retrospectively. So we'll spend 2 weeks on chapter 6 when we get back. So this is my plan. You know, let me just do this really quickly. So we have January, I was thinking January 20th here, the 20th and the 27th. So we'll do care, sections 41, 42. And then on the 27th, we'll begin with sections 75 through 83, and we'll take 2 weeks to do that. I think it would be February 3rd, if I'm not mistaken. You know, so you have February 3rd and to the 27th. So this is going to be on, you know, temporality, right, and you know, everything from Zeitlichkeit to Temporalität. There are many, many different distinctions he makes in terms of the German language. You'll have the appointed time, everyday time, the time of the now. So we're going to go through all of this. Again, I mentioned crucial for an understanding, again, is footnote to section 82. Right, and this is the famous footnote, very famous footnote, at least in among philosophers. What's up, Rach?
No, never mind. Just looking at dates.
Oh, they're not good dates because of the.
No, it's fine.
I'm
just gonna miss the 27th, but that's okay.
Okay, well, I mean, we can you know, maybe
don't
skip a
worry.
week if you want, or.
No, it's okay. Don't worry.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it'd be good that, you know, we all together here, so we can maybe the 3rd and the 10th, right? We'll go through this three weeks, you know, and then we'll go back to, you know, the rest of the retrospectively back to care, authenticity, inauthenticity, you know, the totality of being, you know, in terms of the authentic and the inauthentic, and then we'll go to his philosophy of history. Okay? Something like that, right? We're going to go through what's historicality, how does Don do this, and then again, what Chris sent out, I guess she'll be here soon, I didn't want to, you know, but you know, Derrida wants to talk about the history of being as early as 1964, 65 in his early lectures on, and he stays away from using the word ontology. So, you know, he's interested in the phenomenological destruction of the tradition, and this is when he starts to first use the word deconstruction, right, in his work. This is Derrida. But anyway, we're going to look at history in terms of how Heidegger is looking at the history of being, right? Not history as Althusser has it, or as historical materialism has it. We're going to set that off through a kind of history of being and sending. Okay? Just, you came at the right time. I was just mentioning Derrida's lectures from 64 to 65. So grab a seat. There are plenty up here if you want. I mean, yeah. Yeah.
Track work.
I heard, and I'm very sorry about that.
Wow.
I didn't know it would be such an ordeal coming to Brooklyn. I know it's an ordeal getting to Manhattan, but yeah, for a lot of us. Yeah.
It started at Canal and all the way after that.
Right.
Piling up with your
All right. It's all right. The new tax bill is going to help a lot, you know. Right. Yeah. So we'll do that afterwards. So we'll move backward. I figure we can at least finish our, and I consider this a kind of introductory reading, you know, with some substance, but at least we'll finish hopefully by middle of March, you know, end of March with this, if you guys are willing. I mean, I don't mind, you know, going on to something else, but I think we should finish as much as we can, and at least we'll have multiple things for people's research, for people's, you know, own work, for their edification, whatever you're going to do with it, you know, that of course is for you. I mean, you know, we want to really look at this horizon of temporality and interpretation in Heidegger, and if this has relevance for us going forward, you know, in a way. So, I mean, speaking of which, you know, I just, you know, if we can do something else here. So, and Chris, I was mentioning temporality, that we would meet next time January 20th, and we would do the section called on care, sections 41, 42. I'll send out an email on this, and then the 27th, the 3rd of February, and the 10th, if I'm not mistaken, those are the Saturdays in February. We would do sections 75 through 83, which are on temporality, right? And I mentioned the famous footnote, which Usia and Grame is one good reading of. You know, there are other good readings, but yeah, it's crucial, this note on a note, the long footnote. You look at Heidegger's notion of being as time, and the reversal that we'll talk about as well. Right? And just in that light, just let me just do this here. You know, you do have in the structure, you have the beginning, in terms of temporal, the project, right? The understanding. This is all part of today in some ways, you know, and this is the having been here. Okay, so, you know, you have the beginning here in the Dasein, right, in the there-ness, the world, and I was going to go back over this too. The existentiality, you know, we begin with a point from existentiality, how our project, this is all in the present and future in the beginning, right? The understanding and the being seen from the perspective of death. This is all necessary, if you will, in terms of a beginning and also futurally, you know, oriented, right, oriented. Then also what's going on, of course, is the having been, facticity, which is part of that having been, you know, how you have been, right? It kind of lays you out in terms of your current contingency, if you will. Being projected, right? Being thrown in some ways, right? I mean, if I could put also Gewortheit here, thrownness. The attunement, Befindlichkeit, right? We've talked about this last week. I was going to go back over this a little bit today. And disposition, and then the dictogenic, having been what one has fallen prey to. And this is part of the, you know, the verbs of being falling into something, right? In a way, okay? So this might be good as a kind of, you know, elementary, again, diagram of what we're doing here today. Then, you know, also going back to world, and remember, we're kind of working now through Dasein and world, right? And Dasein is in a world. World is being presupposed, and the worldhood of world. You know, and we went through that, right? So you have in the world, we're in the world. Again, the in have to be in a world, right? And in the world, right? Worlding, right? And is that? And then we go to, secondly, in the movement, we go to everyday Dasein. And to me, the crucial part here is not only the being, but the there. And if you remember, Heidegger is trying to break up the there, that spatiality and spatio-temporal aspects in the Cartesian sense, in Cartesian space, as well as the way we commonly look at space, even in Kant, is really the abyssal plane. Okay, if you want to try to think of it that way, I've tried to, you know, determine. So you're always working here in terms of Abgrund, the abyss. Of the there. And that's happening in both Cartesian space, you know, he's going down with this, so to speak, right? He's thinking this, he's going down with this, and you know, and also in the Kantian, and this is what he says, Kant cannot go beyond this, right? He cannot get back to the Grund, the Urgrund in the ground, right? He doesn't have the capacity in terms of the transcendental imagination. He recoils at this very thing, right? This Abgrund in the abyss. And this becomes, you know, in some ways, formally, again, I want you, you know, this is going on in, and I'm trying to situate this to, so you can either read about it or at least have a reference point. The Davos conference in 1929, in which the argument with Cassirer takes place, right, which actually regenerates Heidegger's, or really generates Heidegger's reputation as the, quote, German genius of philosophy in the you know, the 20s and the 30s, right, that everybody starts flocking to these classes. Not everybody, but, you know, certainly not Adorno, but Marcuse went. As did Karl Loveth, as did Helene Weiss, as did, you know, many people, you know, of rank. Hannah Arendt, of course, you know. Now the new thing is the Hannah Arendt Heidegger thing, that Heidegger is a sexual predator. This is the new thing out there, and you know, he was really a, you know, another one that used his influence on the young 18-year-old student. Yeah. Anyway, it's endless. I mean, you know, it really is in some ways. So, and here we have a lifelong, you know, relationship, intellectual engagement, you know, from her, you know, 50 years. Right. This relationship goes on, and now we get this reduced to, you know, yeah, he took advantage of the poor, you know, 18-year-old, you know, free-thinking student, right? And if this isn't commonplace, right, throughout history, this is another thing, right? Totally commonplace.
Very commonplace.
And it goes back to the Greeks, you know, it goes back to even earlier, yeah, but it's tremendously commonplace, right.
I can tell you
Yeah,
that.
I'm aware, Chris, yes, I know, you know, yeah, yes, yes, yeah. You know, I remember I'll say this anyway, 1969, you know, I'm with my girlfriend, she likes her English professor. Listen, I'm going to go sleep with him. She tells me, you know. So, you know, anyway, this was commonplace, always already. Richard Schechner, yeah, anyway, another very well-known Tulane Drama Review. Right? He had to leave Tulane. He took Tulane Drama Review with him to go to NYU and became a major player in the theater department. Anyway, stories are abound, you know, but this is what we're reduced to in Trumplandia. This is what we talk about.
I think we
Russia-
have to make
Russia gave-
distinctions, though.
Yes, of course.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, I know that, but I'm talking
it's-
about how does this become a dominant discourse? Since today, in some ways, it's really one of the topics that he engages in language is idle talk and gossip, right? And how much of this, in some ways, yes, go ahead. I want to hear.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to justify it. Please don't.
No,
read it
no,
that way.
there was a whole discussion of this on NPR this morning. I listened to it to get the party line, you know, to see.
That
what
is
the-
party line.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
You bet. But I mean, you know, it's the Democratic Party line.
Yes, of course.
Usually,
Yeah,
you know,
of course.
And this woman was, like, her whole thing was kind of like, well, you know, how can, you know, and she was talking more, you know, in terms of politicians, you know,
Right.
and how can we tell our children that they can go into politics when it's, you know, it's such a seedy place, you know?
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, right, you know, so you of the professional class will have a really tough time telling your you know, your professional to-bes, you know, it's just, you know, I don't know, you know, the arrogance and the stupidity, you know.
Right. No, I mean, I'm sorry, but I mean, I just think it's necessary to talk about that as a, you know, as a symptom at
Sure.
some levels. Nobody's trying to, you know, either advocate or condone that kind of practice
No.
as some of these people are doing, like the Weinsteins, the Tobacks, and these kind of people in a certain way. But when it becomes part and parcel of an everyday culture of which takes up 30% of media time, I'm sure you can do a mathematics of this, that it becomes really a symptom to keep people's minds off for much more, you know,
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
What they're actually
how the
fucking
new
doing.
servitude is working, and also how this sets up a policing as well, simultaneously. What's really going on here is a kind of policing that's going to, you know, shape behavior in a way that it takes away from any kind of, you know, play of the instincts, playfulness, all
Yeah.
these things become eliminated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
have you now?
I mean, I'm walking around the Xerox machine to make sure I don't bump into anybody. You know, no, I'm just saying, you know, this
No,
is,
no.
I'm not.
There's a
I'm not.
difference between graduate school and undergraduate. You know, when you're talking about 18-year-olds versus who, you know, in graduate school, it's a question of who's taking advantage of whom.
That's not a bad point. Yes, in
Yeah.
some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. Both
Well,
working
even-
on a night move, huh? Like the little what was his name? Bob C. Working
Yeah.
on a night move, whatever it was. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, even undergraduate. I mean,
Yeah.
this friend of mine, she was like, you know, I'm going to sleep with this guy because I'm just curious.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me go on here. So anyway, this abyssal plane, being in the world, the question of the there, and then the being there is the existential constitution of the there, which again goes back to the world, right? Of the there. Right? So there's no there without world and worldhood. And what he's trying to avoid, once again, is this subjectivity. Right, if you remember, he's really trying to avoid, you know, quote unquote scientific, you know, and I put that heavily in quotes, scientific objectivity in doing this. That's why world is sort of a priori and a presupposition here. That's why he begins with world. You know, he doesn't begin just with everyday life. It's the world. You have to be in a world, or in a world being, right, first, right? Right, in the world, right? Then to your everyday ness, right, the Dasein, and then the being there-ness, which is the existential constitution of the there. And with that there-ness, we get all these sections, beginning with chapter 29, attunement, mood, if you want, in English, attunement, disposition, right, etc. Fear as a mode of attunement, right, we begin to see this. And then we go on to understanding, which is crucial, right? And understanding and discourse, which leads into curiosity, ambiguity, and yeah,
So
idle talk.
is
yeah.
it accurate to say that he's
Yeah.
doing this because, at least in these pages, because if the world is a priori that we're thrown into, right, then there is no need to create the space, the Cartesian space, which defines our world the way Descartes does, and thus he can avoid. Thus Heidegger can actually do philosophy in a non-Cartesian way. Like, is that
He's
sort of
trying
the
to
goal?
he's trying to go beyond.
In other words,
quote,
how
I
do
was
you go
going to do
beyond?
something else
Yeah.
today, but yeah, to talk about that as well.
Is that part of the move?
Yeah, that's part of the move. The move is partially to get outside of the subjectivism that he ultimately calls subjectivism, right, of Cartesianism, and also the this metaphysics of subjectivity, which leads me to my next kind of, I guess, introductory remarks today before going to the text. But what I want us to realize once again is that you have you have some temporality going on here, obviously, right? There's always the temporality, right? That at the beginning level, you begin to have this existentiality from the everydayness and the existential constitution of the there, right? Through, everyday Dasein and one's attunement, which is very important. It's not, and out of this we get the whole question of affects going forward, which we can talk about as much. Everybody talks about affect today, affect in psychology, what's one's affect. So this is all pretty much coming out of this attunement that Heidegger is speaking of. As well as, the question of language, right? First of all, how do we understand what is necessary for our understanding? And then ultimately, what is necessary in terms of language and understanding. So this is where he's going in chapter 5, which for me is very, very significant in terms of grounding us as Dasein, right? Really understanding Dasein as the existential, analytic, right? As the part and parcel of the analytic. We are the interrogators, as I mentioned when we first started. You have a question? You have a
Yeah,
thought?
so
Yeah.
back to Artaud's statement in a way. So he's taken down Cartesian philosophy, and now he's building back out his philosophy.
This is the phenomenological destruction at work. And you see he's very careful at how he does it.
So he's
right.
taking
I'm
it
not
down,
just saying
and now
you
he's
don't
building
want to
back
just
up.
deal with esoteric propositions. He's going through this carefully in terms of showing how Cartesian space still yields a scientific objectivity on a good day, and you still even have the subject-object dichotomy working out.
But we've gotten rid of that now, essentially.
According to Heidegger, the destruction has taken place because the movement for him is going to be on the Dasein. But just in all fairness to Heidegger and to Descartes, he goes back to Descartes to talk about our age is still framed, if you will, the world picture. And this is coming out of the Cartesian thinking.
Okay.
Right? This is coming out of Cartesian thinking. As is allopathic medicine, the mind-body dualism that we're all subjected to, right? We do not begin, you don't go to your doctor and they say, how's your body?
Yeah.
The head doctor never asks you, how's your body feeling? They
But
wanna
so
know
far
what's
in
going on in your head. Then you go to your your general practitioner, they don't ask you how you are psychologically, right? So we have this basic split that has been, codified and become so institutionalized at this point that is, indebted to Cartesianism, even though he thought he was doing a great service to humankind. And maybe at his time he was, but Heidegger sees the limitations of this in the new science. And this is the science, Cartesianism, which corresponds to the mathematization of nature. Right? And universal mathesis is at the basis. And, as I put up, for Descartes, at the basis is the universalis, right? Mathesis. Right? This is the new ground, the foundation. This is the foundation. Yeah, it gets bad, huh?
Sorry.
It's okay. No worry.
I'm just trying to,
Yeah. So at the foundation, Descartes is a foundationalist thinker. Right? Descartes is responsible as a philosopher, particularly in the meditations on first philosophy, but even more so, I think, from, if you want to really be careful about this, rules 4, 5, and 6 for the direction of mind. This was he wrote 21 rules you know, before the, you know, yeah. So if you look at rules 4, 5, and 6 very carefully, you'll get the idea of what our scientific project is about. And this movement towards exactitude and precision. Used in logistics, right? Logistical thinking, used in medical thinking. All these practices are pretty much coming out of these 3 rules, 4, 5, and 6 of the rules for the direction of mind. And then, of course, the discourse on the method, of which he reduces the history of logic to 4 sufficient rules. Okay. I'm doing this because Heidegger knows, you know, listen, it's a working through. It's not just, you know, quote, I'm going to slam this, I'm going to diss it. He's working through this in a that's why it's called positive destruction. It's not that we're over it, right? But he's unlaying bare, right, what has happened to kind of clear the ground to get to this level of the existentiality of the there.
Okay.
And our being there in the world, right? So, yeah, okay?
Okay.
All right? Yeah. So it's through us as Dasein, the there-ness of Descartes, you know, the interpretation, the hermeneutic, if you will, of these rules, right, in Descartes, that sort of open us up, again, to being able to positively overcome.
So is he replacing it? Would you say he's replacing it, or?
Well, I wouldn't read it just at that level. I'm just trying to say, yeah. I mean, there is a replacement going on, but there's also a process of overcoming always happening.
So
and I think it's better to keep open that way instead of he substitutes this for that, you know?
Okay.
I mean, the reason I'm doing these things is just to show you, you know, the valuableness of this new vocabulary.
Yeah.
I mean, again, this is nothing but a new vocabulary, but again, it's a new, a philosophy.
Yeah.
No, it's
you know?
interesting. In some way, it's kind of like a...
And it's a way of getting away, you know, if you remember my diagrams, getting away from substance and substantiality, right, earlier on, right? This is another thing, too, that Descartes, in the cogito, right? Right? The cogito, right? And Heidegger says he splits this, right? Thinking and being, right? At the beginning, right? That I'm a thinking, right, thing, and I just exist, right? So existence and thinking are separated somewhat in the ergo, right? And they should not be, right? So he's looking at that as well, yeah? Breaking up this dualism, yeah? So this is an attempt, again, to take on, you know, Western dualism and Western, you know, dichotomous thinking as well, and what we call binaries today, you know, to undo the binary. But as we know from Derrida, in terms of a deconstructive maneuver, when you're undoing binaries, there's always that in-between. You know, it's not just a simple thing that you're ending up on one side or the other of the binary, or you've overcome it. You're still in that tension, right? But you understand it as a binary that has underneath it, you know, this Saussurean principle language is a differential system without positive terms. One's canceling out the other. Yeah.
Okay.
Saussure's the great accountant in linguistics. He figures out, you know, how language borrows on both sides of the equation. How parole will fit into the language system, the utterance, right, and language. You know, he has many those distinctions. So anyway, this is another aspect of in modern times. But again, what I want you to understand is, you know, since we talked about this, Dasein and spatiality is being thrown into question, and the new notion is world. Right? Yeah. And Descartes, as I said, you know, I think I mentioned this last week and wrote, you know, he wrote a trilogy, Discourse on the Method, right? And Le Monde was the last part of that trilogy, the world.
Right.
So they're thinking through these you know, they're thinking through this, but again, Heidegger wants to get away from this. Right? Now, I mean, Badiou, on the other hand, right, has a bit of the Cartesian in him still and wants to ground a mathematical ontology. Right? So you have an old debate here playing out in the history of philosophy that's very, very dense between mathematics, you know, and the divided line in Plato versus that of the poets who were expelled from the Republic. Because Heidegger is going to go the way of the poiesis. ultimately, whereas Badiou will say the mathematical is more solid, even though he's very well aware of the poets, right, in a sense. So you have this kind of, back and forth happening. Not that they are all firmly on one side or the other. Again, we have to understand this tension, but clearly Badiou falls on, the mathematical, right, on that side of the ontology. Right? And poetic ontology is where Heidegger will go in the end. The thinker names being, but it's the poet who speaks being or utters being. Right? So he has the thinker and the poet together. Right? And this is an old story, by the way, I know you've never read this, maybe Chris has read some of his poetry. Paul Valar, a French poet, actually turned away from poetry and engagement towards mathematics. He started to move that way. And so he's an interesting figure in the history of French literature and French thinking as a figure who went the way of mathematics. And of course, this is a very rich tradition. Henri Poincaré, Évariste Galois, right? These are all people. And then you have the people that actually helped Simondon, towards Stiegler on technical objects. You have another kind of tradition there with the mathematics, of Lothman is his name, Albert Lothman. I'm Lautman, Albert Lothman. Very, very crucial for Badiou and others. So you do have these people that are actually out there that we don't read so actively because we have this 2-culture, 3-culture educational system. The sciences over here, right? None of us really study neurology. None of us are keeping up with brain research, which is fascinating. And the philosopher, one of Derrida's, pupils, and now Catherine Malibu is doing good work on plasticity and the brain, and this is a new way she's doing things. So you have these people, one part of the culture that separated the sciences. Then of course you have the humanities, right? And neither's talking to each other. And then of course the third culture is of course the practical professions, right? The pre-professional trainings, and all this. So you have these cultures that don't communicate or speak with each other at all. So we're left in the dark. We don't really talk about history of mathematics. We don't really speak to, the creativity that's going on in mathematics and the sciences. We stay in humanities, right, etc. And architecture, which, takes from both the texture of the principle and, the moment, right, is something that borrows from both in many ways. But very, very few disciplines really have this communication. So in some ways, the Cartesian moment still plays out in most of modern scientific thinking, with Kant, both Cartesian and Kant, right? These are two antagonists, but at the same time interlocutors with Heidegger. So think of this also as a project. This phenomenological destruction is a speaking between, it's an interlocution, like the highest part of the dialogical, right? That you're really involved in a real dialogue with the history of thinking.
But even though you would call all of these things ontic domains, essentially, and
for Heidegger, yes, they're still ontic domains.
Right.
Yeah. Again, he's going to, and this is the other thing I wanted to do. He wants to again overcome metaphysics, and he still thinks this is part of the metaphysical tradition. Yeah, please.
That's very interesting. I'm sort of following these lectures from the Bulgarian comrades, the leftist philosophers.
Right.
And they're logicians, like dialectical logic, or
Right.
But they're also well versed in philosophy, and their critique of logic is that even dialectical, like Adorno, who they admire and they draw upon, they say that the difficulty with logical thinking, if that's why maybe that's why Heidegger is not using logic, right? Like,
Well, he is using a kind of law. I mean, there is an ontologic here.
right, but it's not.
I mean, I want you to realize that it's an ontologic. And the term itself, ontology, has a lot. I mean,
Right.
the logos,
Right.
in terms of giving reason, giving an account of,
Right.
it's not syllogistic reasoning.
using
It's
some
not the
Aristotelian or
Aristotelian, forms of logic that are being used. But there is at work,
Right.
obviously, a logic.
But he's
right?
not using the syllogistic Hegelian.
No, no.
And what the philosophers were saying there
Right.
was that the difficulty with using syllogistic logic to study other thinkers, like to do a history of philosophy, is that often the trap is you use your own logical syllogisms to explain some other thinkers' sort of thought, and that becomes sort of like a
Right. Well
overlay.
put. You know,
It
you're
becomes an
putting
overlay.
it exactly like René Descartes would
I
put
see.
it. I'm
Right.
sorry to interrupt
No,
you,
no,
but you're on the
right.
same plane
So-
as Descartes when he says, I need to reduce the history of logic. The syllogistic reason is only good for explaining things.
Right.
He
And
says
then-
this.
And
Yeah.
then Heidegger
Yeah.
doesn't fall into that trap because Heidegger's sort of focus on ontology, right, rather than ontic, regional thought, bypasses these traps.
Right.
So it's this vast project to sort of attempt to engage with Descartes on Descartes' terms as closely as possible
Yes, of
without
course.
imposing his own logic on Descartes'
correct.
thought, which
That's
is
correct.
what Hegel does with Aristotle.
Well,
and
just-
but
yeah.
Marx doesn't fall into that as much. But so it's interesting how this. But it's so difficult to do this.
Well, yes, that puts it mildly, right?
It's so difficult to do
Right,
this.
right. I mean, I don't know if you noticed, he did talk about dialectic in its beginning, right? In Parmenides, and how Hegel does not go beyond Parmenides,
Yeah.
and that's the birth of dialectics. So you don't get that in Adorno, that it goes back to the Parmenidean prong. And so many of the Heideggerians, and I know Josh has read Introduction to Metaphysics, in which the Parmenidean and Heraclitean, fragments are engaged, right, in terms of being as permanence and being as flux, or being as change. So
Yeah.
this whole idea of change,
It's
and
yeah.
permanence is really being worked out here.
It's almost like since Hegel and Marx, we have here the next sort of major attempt to think logically, through this ontological logic, without mirroring Hegelian or Aristotelian thinking.
I'm just going to go ahead just to read it since we're on it, just in the section. It'd be good maybe to go there. 165, Curiosity is the section towards the end of chapter 5. The care for seeing is essential to the being of human being. This is the top of 165, section 36, Chris. Curiosity, the second paragraph in the middle. The care for seeing is essential to the being of human being. Thus, an inquiry is introduced which attempts to discover the origin of all scientific investigation of beings and their being by deriving it from the kind of being of design which we mentioned. This Greek interpretation of the existential genesis of science is not a matter of chance. It brings to an explicit understanding what was prefigured in the statement of Parmenides, which in Greek is really that being and thinking are the same. Being is what shows itself in pure, intuitive perception, and only this seeing discovers being. Right? Pure, intuitive perception. Primordial and genuine truth lies in pure intuition. This thesis, henceforth, remains the foundation of Western philosophy. The foundation, right here, right? The Hegelian dialectic has its motivation in it, and only on its basis is that dialectic possible. So unlike Adorno, who sees dialectic both in nature, like Engels, and in the social
He's like
relations.
Heidegger here. Yeah.
Yes, he is. They're very close in this regard, right? Is dialectical possible, even though Lukács will not go back to the Greek. But Lukács begins with Kant and, the antinomies and, of course, Hegel, right?
And Adorno takes the side of Heraclitus. essentially, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, to a degree, but he's not really looking at the possibility of dialectical thinking. Heidegger is looking at the possibility of how this kind of, it's section 36, curiosity, and it begins in the second paragraph, about halfway through. I began with the section that says the care for seeing is essential. Yeah. And this is scopophilia, by the way. This is an interesting page because this kind of anticipates, this drive today for, pornography, right? This is scopophilia at work, right? The desire to see, right? Indeed, And phenomenology, in some ways, is a kind of, pornography, anyway, a kind of, high-level pornography of seeing. There's really witnessing in that sense, if you want to look at it that way. Yeah, of course, yeah. So we'll go back to this because then the eyes, seeing belongs properly to the eyes, right? Right, etc. Right. The experience of senses in general is called the pleasure of the eyes, right? Because even the other senses take upon themselves a certain resemblance to the function of seeing where cognition is concerned, since they're the function of seeing as a privilege. Look, let me just mention one other thing that might be helpful here, I hope. I mean, this is precognition. This is pre-knowledge that he's really doing here, right? Heidegger. He is not yet, he's not in the realm of an epistemological project. And this is part of what he's, both Adorno and Heidegger are criticizing, is this Cartesian epistemological project toward certainty. That the drive for certainty, the metaphysical drive, the history of Western metaphysics ends up in two positions, if you will. On the one hand, the Cartesian drive to certainty, right, and objectivity, of which our modern sciences are built upon, revised, and interpreted further by Kant and maybe an advance upon. And then, mainly because it's Newton and not Galileo, who was the scientific counterpart. And then secondly, of course, we have the work of Hegel, that we somehow get to absolute knowing in the phenomenology, right? We come full circle to absolute knowing, in the three spheres being art, religion, and philosophy. And that philosophy ultimately recapitulates all of this, and we have a reconciled dialectic in this process of absolute knowing. So I, Hegel, am the truth, right? Yep. I, Descartes, have given a method that will give us all certainty in the human sciences. And that method would be, nothing is true unless it's self-evident. We have to begin there always. Self-evident, and the self is important. Must be evident to the self, to the subject, Cartesian subject. 2, break down problems into their parts, many parts as possible, in order to solve it. So we begin to get this notion of the particular, right? And sometimes goes out, shaved off. Thirdly, to begin with the most simplest idea and move to the more complex, and then you build an order of reason around this movement, right, instead of a natural order of precedences. It's against nature, if you will, in some ways, or against, looking just at nature natural. And then fourth and finally, comprehensive, and as enumerate everything possible. These are the 4 basic sufficient rules in, deductive reasoning for René Descartes, of which most of the scientific project is built. And I would again suggest reading rules 4, 5, and 6. And this is in the second part of the discourse on method, when he goes to the stove-heated room and starts to have a soliloquy with him, in the stove-heated room. Right? Yeah, which Foucault and Derrida have a big debate about. We talked about this, if you remember, in the when we did Madness and Civilization. we focused a little bit on the cogito, where your friend got upset, your friend from India, because her father is being kept alive by psychiatric drugs and is having somewhat of a life, and she got upset. We were not speaking against that, that sometimes, the pills can work. For a while, we were speaking at another level on that. But yeah, this is a big debate between Derrida and Foucault on the history of madness. So this also has a lot of contemporary relevance vis-a-vis psychiatry, what determinations of what is mad and what isn't, right? Who has access to the city of reason? What a thin line reason and madness really are. We see this in some of certainly the anti-psychiatry movements, but also when you look around yourself, if you use Cartesian logic or any Leibnizian logic or any kind of logic on what's coming down today, this is total insanity. The mad are in power. I mean, the insane are really in power. Yeah.
Yeah.
In a sense. Yeah, right?
Yeah. Well,
right.
well, Trump.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I'm just playing here, but
the National Health Service is now being forbidden to use Cartesian language. There no more evidence, no more.
In the U.S., you mean?
Yeah.
You mean there's no more evidential reasoning in terms of discovery?
Right.
Really?
Yeah. They can't use. There are certain words that are being outlawed in the writing.
Oh, I see. You mean you can't use such things that this is going to be
evidence-based.
Science-based.
Science-based, evidence-based.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, no more.
Sure. We don't need evidence, right?
No, we don't need evidence.
Cryptocurrencies. That's all we need. Yeah, new ciphers. All right, and siphons, ciphers, siphons, and silos. All right. Yeah, right. Okay, so I mean, this again is what one of the going back a long kind of detour. Remember, and I use the word detour and I use it advisedly. In a way, what Heidegger's really doing is providing a detour through all of this, right? This is really what's going on in this kind of path, right? Ultimately, that this is really the history. He is really trying to write, if you will, the history of what he would consider errancy in the whole metaphysical tradition. That this is going to be closed. And I did this after Chris, wrote me back about Derrida this morning. So I did a little thing on the metaphysics of subjectivity to situate, some of our French friends. Let me see if I brought it with me. I think I did. Yeah. So let me do this as well, because this is kind of important for the overall project. I think I have it. I think I did it this morning.
Now you're cold. Turn it back on.
What's that?
It's cold now.
What happened?
Rachel, it's
Oh,
cold.
she's got to turn it back on? Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah. Good exercise, yeah. Yeah.
I think the problem is
Let's put it on low.
No, high.
Oh, on high? Okay.
You get cold, really cold.
back on.
All right.
Just one, not two. I think that was the problem.
Yeah, let me do this really quickly too, and then we'll go to the text, and we'll go back to this whole section of relevance and signs too.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
If
I
it
don't
makes
mind.
sense,
No,
it
I don't
makes
mind.
sense.
Okay. So anyway, so the task here, and everybody has this. I can just anyway. Again, to read Heidegger, and to read him, I think, productively, one has to presuppose closure, right? Closure of this is from, in Heidegger's language, I'm not going to put him here, but from Plato to Nietzsche, that this ends up in the will to power. This is why the later Heidegger will speak more and more about releasement rather than the will. And our real freedom is without the will, right? And it's in German, Gelassenheit. This is late Heidegger. This is not the Heidegger of being in time that I'm, making this to. But the Western metaphysics, I would put in here Hegel, because I don't consider Nietzsche to be the final. I think he does something more to the closure. And we can talk about that later after we read a little more of this. Right? So you have to have the closure of the Western metaphysical tradition from Plato, that somehow the truth, right, ultimately culminates in the will to power. Mm-hmm. And this is what Western metaphysics breeds. Right? No. Okay? So, what he's really trying to do, again, too, here, is, defeat, if you will, the metaphysics of subjectivity, although he still has, in being in time, a, philosophy of subjectivity. Okay? So there's a lot of ambiguity here, right? And the early Heidegger is still working within the philosophy of subjectivity and the philosophy of the subject. Okay? Now, in the history of subjectivity, right, to go to the French, and where Chris, got me thinking about this morning. The history of subjectivity, right? In this tradition, we have already read Foucault, right? Foucault speaks about, and we read the essay last semester, The Ends of Man, right? Which takes into account, right? Man is an invention of recent date. One, perhaps, nearing its end. Most of you remember The Ends of Man, Derrida, and it's not the end of man, it's the ends, remember, plural, right? That essay that he gave May 12th, 1968, in New York City at the Hilton Hotel. In May of '68, but he was in New York giving this.
At the Hilton.
He wasn't out in the streets of Paris.
He went back to it.
Oh, okay.
He went back. Foucault was in Tunisia, though.
Okay.
Yeah, in Tunis. So anyway, so Foucault, this is his take on the closure of Western metaphysics and the history of subjectivity. There's no subject, right? Right? Now, the question here is that the subject, or the main subject, is never really liquidated. Despite all our attempts to kill off the subject, and everything that's been interpreted, there is no liquidation of the subject. There may be, if you will, a decentered subject, and that would be Lacan, a decentered subject in subjectivity. But Lacan does not liquidate the subject. In fact, he begins one of his seminars, I want to attune your ears again to the subject. Now, what is the subject? The subject is a being before the law. That's what a subject is. A being before the law, yes. And for all of them, all the French, because they're very good at this Napoleonic, code and, the penal system, etc. They're always thinking philosophically alongside the juridical, right? This is why interpolation in Althusser's sense, right? It is a being that is being before the law. Hey, you over there, you're under arrest, right? And of course, this brings up Kafka's great piece in the trial before the law, of which, you know, pages of commentary have been done on. This door is for you. And that's one way of interpreting kind of the authenticity, you know, inauthenticity in Heidegger. Does one enter that door, right? Is that the authentic, this door is for you, right? This being in the world, right? In a sense, right? So this is one way you could, you know, kind of look at literature as a supplement, if you will, to this philosophical, you know, treatise called Being and Time, right? This door is for you, okay? Before the law, right? So the subject is always a subject subjected to the law and always held responsible. And most of you know the story that, you know, someone must have framed up, that's the first sentence in Kafka, Joseph K. Right? For he woke, you know, to find himself arrested. Gregor Samsa, which is an acronym of Samsa and Masoch, is actually transformed. But Joseph K. is arrested for not what he does not know what he's done. So in some ways, it's very Heideggerian. In your contingency, you're being there in your thrownness, right? In this contingent nature, one has to face what? That door of the law.
I see.
In some ways, right? Good. Yeah. I've already got a television program ready for Roy Moore. Judgment with Roy Moore. With Judge Moore, right? Judgment Day, right? I'm going to get a TV program. That'll be a big hit in the South. Right? Here comes the Judge Roy, right? Right? Anyway, right? We're gonna focus on specific kind of cases, right? Anyway, I would not be surprised if cable takes this up. I mean, it is an idea, but anyway, we can do Madison Avenue here. I want to go back to this. You know, that was outside the box, so to speak. Anyway, so for Lacan, right, etc. So what you have here in the history, and of course Derrida is always in the process of trying to deconstruct, right, the subject and subjectivity, right? Another one of the, you know, we want to call these at least the big three for American purposes, right? The big Frenchies, the big three, Derrida, Foucault, and Lacan, right? In some ways. And of course, Althusser, history is a process, a trial, process, a trial, again, you know, without a subject. Right? So it may be just the subject, you know, subjectivity, and this is Althusser's moment to Marx that somehow history is taking place, right, without a subject, right? So the subject is decentered, denied, or withdrawn. Foucault returns to the subject, obviously, in his ethical and moral writings on governmentality, when he's in California at Berkeley, 83. Before his death, 82, 83, Vermont, 81, 82. This is probably, Arto, why a lot of people like the Foucault in your group, the later Foucault.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
It's
because
about
he goes
me.
back
Me,
to a
yeah.
return to an ethical
It's kind of a
subject
liberal
and a moral position, right? And it becomes a discourse more of morality and ethics, if you will, than a discourse of, you know, the closure of an epoch.
I see.
And what can we do? So in some ways, Foucault, for all the Nietzscheanism of his own self, right, he actually becomes very conservative against the Nietzschean free and open horizon, right? Because Nietzsche, you know, has basically dismantled everything to open up the horizon for the tempters of the future, right? This is what he's doing, you know, just kind of finally wash the horizon clean, you know, in many ways towards the new epoch. Yeah. So Nietzsche, in some ways, you never see Deleuze going that way. Deleuze will play out this, and I think that may be part of their break. I'm not sure. You know, I know they had big arguments during the late 70s. You know, so I mean, it's just one thing to think about. I'm not saying that I'm right about this, but I have a suspicion that this move towards governmentality back was a return to the subject, and it was a return to the subject of morality, etc. Right? After all of his Heideggerian influence, etc., the governmentality, he wanted a new ethic. So you see the ethic developing as early as the care for the self, which is very Heideggerian in its title, right? As well as, of course, the book on, the whole history of sexuality, but the uses of pleasure, in which, actual programs are being developed there, ethical demands. I don't know if you've read Uses of Pleasure, but Foucault goes through, dietary practices in Greek homosexuality, right? He goes through this in very excruciating detail, right? Of what people were subjected to. Excruciating, yes. Yes. Indeed.
What did they do?
So,
drink milk?
No, there was no. Anyway. Yeah, he has the whole thing of the dietary practices.
Yeah.
Yeah. This wasn't during the philosophical age. This was afterwards.
Yeah.
After Christ.
Vegetarian? What?
Yeah, there was a lot of that.
I'll have to read it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. All right. So anyway, to go back here, the history of subjectivity. Remember that Heidegger, in Being in Time, is still within the subjectivity that Dasein, we, the interrogators, we render transparent in terms of our interrogation in everyday life, still remain within this philosophy of subjectivity. Right? Sartre, on the other hand, too, let's go back up here, as a, kind of mediated figure between Marx and Heideggerian, if you will, for lack of a better term again, Heideggerian existentialism, but, he sort of misinterpreted some of the stuff, not all. In Search for a Method, wants to bring subject activity into the Marxist tradition. Because what did Marxism do but fall prey to almost a Cartesianism? If you want to think about Marxism in terms of the objectivism and the objectivity that was prevalent throughout the 20th century in its thinking. Reductionistic class struggle. Yeah. There are the haves and there are the have-nots, right? All of these things. It took people such as Stanley, a book that's not read of his, Theories of Class, How Class Works, to talk about class as movement, right? Class is also feminism. Class is also black freedom. Class is disability movement. Right? This is really what class is about as movement, not only just camps of the haves and the have-nots, or the old bourgeoisie proletariat, right? In a way. So they're reading it in a different way. So you can see the Cartesianism and this objectification, right, that is going on, that Sartre wants to break up with a new kind of subjectivity. I hope I'm not. Does this help in some senses?
Yeah,
I want to try to keep situating this vis-a-vis our, for lack of a better term. Heidegger's really our contemporary, but our near contemporaries, at least in terms of biological, time and age and all of that. Derrida, Foucault, and Lacan, right? So you have these decentering operations that come back around into a new kind of thinking, reinterpretation, and reinscription of the subject. So, yeah, a reinscription and a reinterpretation. So this becomes, part and parcel of something that on the one hand is being destroyed, right, but remains, right, simultaneously. What remains? What is the excess, if you will, or surplus? So you have reinterpretation. You have Heideggerian restoration, if you will, the nostalgia, if you want to talk about it that way, right? And basically what you have here is after the closure, and this is, again, to go back to our starting point here, the closure, right, of the epoch of metaphysics. This is the closure of an epoch. And unless you're reading from that position, a lot of this will not, deepen in you. You know, you have to really understand we're living, at least from the, you know, these philosophical positions, this kind of closure. We are outside, you know, to put it in art, we're outside the epoch of representation. You know, when we talk about representation, right? And Freud is also, of course, you know, Freud, Lacan, right? Certainly Marx, the decentering as well, right? As you know, and I've talked about this. We have these epochal figures, if you will, that we can read: being as value, being as desire, and being as you know, being as desire, being as will, or as power, and being, of course, as labor, as value. That Marx's insight is value and value form. We're still looking to see what is the value, you know, in that. What does value really mean, ultimately, other than the commodification or the use and the exchange value? We're looking at value itself. We're still trying to think about this, going back to, you know, this project about Wall Street. You know, we really don't know what this is. No. Right? We have to put this into question, right? We know what it is, how Marx, you know, works with it in Capital, that he begins the twofold structure of the commodity form, of a form, right? And he takes two types of values up, but he doesn't really ask the question, what is value? We can answer what is exchange value according to Marx. We can answer what is use value, but with value we can't really answer. Yeah? So this becomes another, you know, another moment, right, in terms of the history of representation, right? And does this become part of a deconstructive maneuver after we have this closure in terms of investigating, you know, again, these ontologies, or what Derrida, you know, to go back to Chris's sending of his lectures, Derrida wants to engage history rather than ontology. He wants to do history in being in his lectures in 64, 65. So he's 34, 35 years old then. He is, you know, thinking about history, right, and the history of this, right, and the history of metaphysics, right, in a sense, and not ontology. And remember, Heidegger is using the term ontology and fundamental ontology against that of metaphysics. Right? Remember that. That is being set up as a moment, right? The fundamental ontology is always sort of the stake here, at least in the early work, right? You know, of which there are many, many regional disciplines. If you can do, for Heidegger, the fundamental ontology, these 2-3 sciences that I was talking about are cultures of learning, the arts, humanities, sciences, pre-professional training programs. All of these do not, you know, are not so separate.
So his
Right,
introduction
yeah.
to metaphysics is, he wrote that in the 30s?
35.
Yeah.
35 was the introduction to metaphysics.
You know, it's interesting. I just
Yeah.
I was reading.
I mean, I'm just trying to give you again. I
Right,
mean, you know, I'll
right.
let- just again, I'm trying to do this in terms of the broader strokes, if you will, more brush strokes, right, across the canvas, so to speak. You know, so that you can kind of ground and say, okay. Then he gives lectures on metaphysics in 35. He makes contributions to philosophy. Then he goes to study this guy for 4 years, 36 to 40, right? Then he does what are the poets for, the remembrances of the poets. So all of these things are part of the career, you know, and it's good to kind of keep this in mind, even though we're dealing with his only book, his systematic treatise, you know, Being as Time. Yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, no,
Yeah, no.
because when you said
Yeah,
about the
yeah, I'm just
fundamental
gonna sit for a
ontology
second,
and then Derrida's attempt was history in being, right?
Yes.
There was a section in the Adorno lecture, I think 16, where I think he took a stab at Heidegger. He said, you know, I'm arguing against some of our thinkers who sort of want to leave history aside temporarily and to find sort of the, what he called, you know, he was referring to worldliness or the world as
Right.
says to find the world, and thus they go to the mountains while still keeping track of the train time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I thought that was a little
It's clever, yeah, of course. I mean, I have no problem with that. I mean, you know, listen, I'm not married to the hunt.
But I don't think, but maybe that was unfair to Heidegger. I mean, a little
Well, I don't know if it's fair or unfair. I think he's right in a certain way, that Heidegger, in some ways had a real naivete about cosmopolitan concerns. He probably had a different kind of naivete about the politics of, obviously National Socialism, and what it was really going towards. I mean, in another way, this was someone that was only about thinking. Right, and this is it. I mean, this is another aspect of all this, right? Who's sitting in the mountains, right? Thinking, and these are people that go to the mountain to see him, to sign the book, and to go have conversations, including some of the greatest, artists, poets, the 20th century. So there obviously was a major influence. Yeah. On the other hand, Adorno's very clever. He's probably, to my mind, one of the greatest dialectical minds that, ever inhabited the planet Earth. So, yeah, I mean, and very, very good at making those maneuvers. However, you can see connections between the two throughout. I mean, I think that in some ways, part of the problem this semester is that Stanley, has missed cloud. We've had to kind of wing some of the, the Adorno. But I mean, this isn't a pretty impressive, explosive combination, Adorno and Heidegger, because these are the two major movements in, continental, or for lack of a better term, European, thought in the 20th century. This is really where it happened. To me, Wittgenstein is another step, a different set of problems, but is a different step, in this regard. So, yeah. So they're both thinking on these planes, So, and Adorno doesn't have the same relationship to poetry that Heidegger does, but obviously Heidegger does not have the same relationship to music that Adorno has. So these are things that you would look at their worlds, if you will, or the there-ness of their Dasein, in terms of trying to understand, how their metaphorics work, how their minds are working, where the referential systems, are. I mean, one of the great texts of Adorno for me is Minima Moralia, which is his Nietzschean aphorisms, which are great on what it means to be a German immigrant in the United States and how they see us, or how they saw it then, right? And this includes, look, he was good friends with Fritz Lang, right? Thomas Mann, he was the consultant to Dr. Faustus. Billy Wilder, who also came over. You have to remember, Hollywood was filled with, communists. Filled. You go back and look at the films in the 30s, and, there have been some studies of this, but not enough in terms of the clever placement of certain conversations. Use of the camera position in these films, how much there is really there, especially in the 30s when they had their control. Now, of course, the Disney strike kind of flushed everybody out right before the, McCarthy era, of which Naomi Klein's uncle was a very active part in, the Disney strike of the animators. But Disney, pretty much took over, right, in this kind of Disneyfication of Hollywood, even though, the studio stayed, and then you got, the Weinstein Company. And in some ways, despite his proclivities, and his actions, very advanced in terms of some of the thinking, in terms of what they promoted. Early Tarantino. Yeah. Yeah,
Well,
they took risks. They took risks, and they were very, very, and in my opinion, very good risks. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, please.
Whereas Disney was a Hitler, he was
Yes, he
sympathetic
was.
to
Oh, yeah.
Hitler.
Walter, yes.
Walter.
They
had the same mustache.
They did.
Did
Well,
they?
everybody was sporting those kind of mustaches.
Oh, I
Even
didn't
Django
know.
Reinhardt. No, I'm just teasing. Yeah, what were we going to say about? I'm sorry. I'm just, yeah.
Yeah, Selma Hayek
Yeah.
wrote a interesting piece about Weinstein. And
Who did? I'm sorry.
Selma Hayek.
Oh yeah, I saw her. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now they're all denying it.
Huh?
They're all denying it.
What did she
What
say?
happened on the
What
Frida?
did she say?
Well, she
Banderas supported her, but some other person said Weinstein was great in getting this film done. I forgot who it was. Some actor. Yeah.
Yeah,
It was
well,
probably,
I mean,
she
made
been to many
Frida
Weinstein
was,
parties.
She produced it. I mean, she acted in it, she produced it, she directed it, and you know, but in going through that, and she got Weinstein to, you know, to take on the project. And, you know, it enabled her to do it, but she went through hell. You know, she was, she was, as she put it, she was everything but raped. But she made the project, and, you know, and said it enabled her to do it, although she wouldn't do it again.
Right. Yeah, well, yeah. I think there was something about the sex scenes in there too. She was getting all excited. Anyway, all right. Let me just go back to a couple of more things on this metaphysics of subjectivity. So for Heidegger, again, going back to this Cartesian notion of space and the Cartesian logic, he basically is saying modern hegemony is the principle of reason. That is what modern hegemony is really in the metaphysics of subjectivity, is the principle of reason. You know, he's really going back to this, you know, in a sense. So for those of you who've read the Metaphysical Foundations of Logic, you know, or on the essence of reasons, this is his attempts to undo the principle of reason, looking at both Descartes and Leibniz in particular. Leibniz in particular on the principle of sufficient reason. Okay, of which some people have said actuarial tables and insurance, tables have come from Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, Friedrich Leibniz, GWF Leibniz, right? Gottfried, I think that's his whole name. Or it's George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. It's Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, right? Double agent, Italy and Germany. Yeah. Yeah, during the period. Yeah. Yeah.
Principles of sufficient reason.
What's that?
Principle
of sufficient reason. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the principles of the Cartesian method, and then you have the Leibnizian principle of reason that he is, you know, undoing in terms of showing this epoch, if you will. He doesn't call it capitalism, he calls it calculative rationality. And in a certain way, it's actually a pretty more interesting, capitalism may be derivative of calculated rationality. It may be a derivative term, you know? Yeah, I mean, it may be only a socio-economic system that's based on calculative rationality. So this is something we need to think about as we go forward to the new, you know, form of, you know, derivative capitalism, if you will, a new kind of circuit that's being created here. Isn't this still based on a Cartesian mathematics and, you know, modern mathematics too? I mean, there are other things going into this, but does this begin with the principle of, you know, sufficient reason as well as calculative reason?
Leibniz called that. That's Leibniz's phrase.
Leibniz used the principle of sufficient reason.
And calculative
rationality is what's used for Descartes. He never used the term calculative rationality.
He
used the right. The term was probably coined. You know, I'm not sure. I mean, Heidegger uses it. I mean, it's used by the Frankfurt School. It's used by a lot. You know, a lot of things. You know, and at times it served as code instead of Marxism. You know, Hegel used to be code for Stalin. You know, you know, it depends on where the context was and where we were at a certain point. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So again, and I want to go back to this too. We'll go back later as well, but. You know, the new question, at least to me, and I think for Heidegger as well, after all this metaphysics of subjectivity, is what is the place? This is a topological question, the place of the subject. What is the place? You know, so you're doing topologies now of the subject, right? Right, rather than typologies, right? So the question of the who takes the place of the Cartesian ego cogito, the I think, is taken over by the who. That is the subject today, the who. Who is speaking? Yeah. Yeah. The who. So the group was pretty much on to this, Peter Townsend and Roger Daltrey. And, yeah. Won't get fooled again. They knew. Maybe a new boss, same as the old boss. Unfortunately, LIU, it's much worse than the old boss. But anyway, it didn't work here. Much worse than the old boss. Anyway, okay, so that I mean, I don't know if that helps with this kind of situating some of these people, this metaphysics of the subject, metaphysics of subjectivity. It does come back around. We are not free of subjectivity. We are certainly not free of calculative rationality. It pervades every aspect of our everyday life. It is part of, in Adorno's case, part of the positum, right? Up a kind of positivism at another level. It has certainly elements of the dialectic that move, and et cetera. And, you can see this. You have contradiction in mathematics. There's a dialectics in mathematics. So anyway, all these things are still obviously with us, and we're bequeathed this future where we have to take a certain path, we have to take a certain orientation, or we're oriented certain ways, but in some ways we have all this bequeathed levels of knowledge that has to be constantly unlearned and undone in order to set us on a kind of new way, and I think Heidegger recognized this much later when he started to think through time and event instead of time, and being the event, and we'll talk about that more. But by as I said, this book is unfinished, right? Remember, this is kind of like the unfinished book, right? Okay, so 1927, the same year, he engages Aristotle's physics, right? And especially book 4, which is about movement, right? And the sequence and series of nows, right? And movement. And kinesis, for the, Pilates. Genetics.
Another German...
Yes, of course. Joseph. Per Joseph. That's with an EF, right? Not a PH, right? Right. Anyway, right. And so anyway, yeah. So the kinesis, numbers of times, motion, all of this in Aristotle, he studies that year, right? In terms of the destruction, phenomenological destruction that he's going to talk about in the beginning. So that's one aspect of the unfulfilled part of this. The other aspect, of course, is done in Kant and the problem of metaphysics. 1929, in which he, goes into the phenomena and the pneumal ranges. And then he begins Time and Being, 1962, is the reversal, where he fleshes out the last part. He fleshes out the last part of this. Yeah. So it's no longer being and time, it's time and being. And now it's possible to read this being as time. Yeah. The detour is really the question of time. And for those of you that know literature and poetry, these great experiments start happening around this time and a little earlier, around this time he's writing this, where he's inscribing this. Of course, Joyce's experiments, where he takes, the 20-year journey from the Odyssey and converts it to everyday life, 24 hours in Dublin, Ireland, in the day of the life of Leopold Bloom, right? And reduced, even though structurally, similar amount of chapters, right? Right, etc. Right? Yeah, William Faulkner was the having been that I put up there. And this is the great thing about the artists, right? They usually are intuitively, they understand this very well and are working. So you have Faulkner. The short story was The Having Been, which is a very subversive story. I recommend. It's about the winning of the freedom of a slave in a poker game. called Was, and also, of course, the first 50 pages of The Sound and the Fury, which is through the mind of an idiot, Benji, right? Right? One of the great fictional experiments of all, right? That is fleshed out temporally more by the Compson family later, right? Quentin Compson in Absalon, Absalon, another example. You know, Kafka, of course, in terms of the Before the Law, right, that we talked about earlier, you know, those kind of experiments. And Proust, the remembrance of things past, of course, the having beenness, which Sartre did not like, thought it was very bourgeois, very dismissive of Proust. Adorno and Benjamin loved Proust, right, of course, and yeah. And so you had this amazing amount of experimentation, you know, of course, stream of consciousness being used, and some of you know that there's a 30-page
Virginia Woolf.
She's another one that did it too. That's correct. Yeah. Virginia Woolf. It was very close to the Freudian circle in
Mrs. Dalloway.
To the Lighthouse. Yep. You know how Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was founded as a title by Edward Albee?
No.
Someone wrote in the Choate prep school bathroom, "Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf?" And Edward Albee went to school there. And he took it off the bathroom wall. Everybody thought he was very clever. There was some student just wrote, "Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf?" instead of the big bad wolf. So, anyway, yeah. A great story. You guys know Virginia Woolf. I mean, you know, she was also connected to the Strachey's, right, and very close to the Freud group and Keynes. This was the Bloomsbury Circle. Leonard Woolf was a publisher of Hogarth Press, right, who translated the collected works of Freud, and, you know, his wife Virginia, of course, the famous novelist, John Maynard Keynes. These were all part of a group in London, in Bloomsbury. Yeah. And around the corner was the Tavistock Clinic, where Anna Freud started, you know, her work with children, you know. And then the fight started with Melanie Klein, and Melanie Klein sort of took over British psychoanalysis. You know, Anna was too nice. Melanie was not especially nice. But, yeah. But anyway, that was another story. But anyway, you see these experiments, and of course, as you know, I mean, in terms of modernity, you know, high modernism, you know, Freud, of course, gave credence, if you will, to all these experiments by the notion of the unconscious. You know, this gave legitimacy to the surrealists. It gave legitimacy to Salvador Dali, you know, that famous photograph with Freud, etc. So the unconscious knows no time. So we can talk about this later too, the no time of the unconscious and the time that Heidegger will, you know, yeah. And Althusser, you know, in his way, ideology knows no time. You know, after the revolution, there will still be ideology, which upset all kinds of Marxists. Everybody said, "Oh, hallelujah, we're going to finally be there." Althusser said, "No, it may even get worse." You know, get Khrushchev his shoe, right, etc. All right, so I don't know. Yeah, so that's sort of the thing. The main thing to remember here is we have a tendency, I think, to liquidate or annihilate the subject in subjectivity. And this is not really what's going on, so to speak, in terms of French, you know, the French appropriations and reappropriations of Heidegger, right? This is really about them, you know, yes, Foucault is going against philosophical anthropology. The antagonists are obviously Kojève and Sartre in that regard, right? And that kind of subjectivity, but again, goes back in a kind of conservative way, in my opinion, and radically conservative, I would say, you know, but still conservative, way back to governmentality and this kind of ethical space, you know, in his later stuff, you know, his later essays and teachings. Certainly in Lacan, you know, the subject comes back in, the subject that is supposed to know, in psychoanalysis, and he begins many of his lectures. So after decentering the subject, right, etc., yeah, which is a Freudian move according to Lacan. You know, remember, you have Lacan, Freud, you have Althusser, Marx, you know, Foucault, Nietzsche, kind of working here in terms of this, you know, and Derrida kind of, you know, standing back, you know, I'm going to deconstruct this, I'll do this, etc. You know, it was really a teacher in a way. Derrida was a kind of modern, teacher, if you will. You know, modern Socrates who wrote, you know. And most of the works read like teachings, right? They read more like teachings rather than actual books or treatises about philosophy, even though De la Grammatologie is a programmatic work, right? You know.
I wonder if the
yeah. So anyway, on
subjectivity, since he hated sort of the society, like liberal capitalist society, bourgeois society, it's. I mean, that could be interpreted in a very revolutionary way. This is a very revolutionary task, you know.
Right.
The liquidation of the liberal subject, you know.
Well, again, I mean, Das Mann could be called. Yes, no, he's. I don't think he's so much against that. I mean, he certainly. We talked about this. The stormtroopers, and you know, Karatani mentions this in Structure of World History. That Heidegger was very much taken by the essay. It wasn't the National Socialists so much, ultimately. It was the essay that Heidegger was taken with, who were against, yes, you're right, I mean, liquidation of the liberal subject in some way. Yeah. I mean, you know, this Heideggerian, you know, conservative revolution, as we've mentioned here before, and you know, the Marxists of their ilk had one common enemy, and that was the liberal, right? You know? And in some cases, for some people, parliamentary democracy as well. And you know, and you could say to the Marxists as well, a kind of democracy that was not really a direct democracy, you know, that they were not for representative democracy, parliamentary democracy, you know, this kind of thing.
Were not
yes, right.
Chinese.
That's right, right. Yes, that's right. Yeah. Okay, so let's try to break down today's reading a little bit. I mean, if you're interested, Book 4 of Aristotle's Physics really is about the nature of change, if you're interested in change. Yes, this is really the Book 4, and, you know, if you remember, Mark Zuss put that on his list, master list.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so section 28, remember, we're being together, taking care, being with, which is concern, and being the self, and being the self opens up the question of the who, right? The who, right? And so going back to section 28, let's start there, and then we can go forward, and then I'll go back to the being the relevance and all that. So, chapter 5, and I was going to bring Aristotle's Rhetoric since he wrote it today, but I didn't feel like carrying it. But anyway, it's, but there are some very great sections, and he mentions it. So, this is the thematic analysis of being in, right? This is this whole chapter 5, and the first thing is being in the world as such, right? Being in a world, right? As such. So he wants to return ourselves back to the phenomena of being in, because we have gone through the structural moment of the world, and we are now looking to get an answer to the question of the who of this being is in its everydayness, right? So we have to go back, you know, the orientation to being in as such, the world as a such. And that's the the taking care moment, right? So, I mean, if I were to rewrite being in time, I would have done care before this, but he wants to get the structural undergrid later, right? First, he wants to begin with these a priori worlds and then being in. So, okay, so the interesting parts here, okay? Page 128. What we have set forth needs to be supplemented in many ways with respect to a full elaboration of the existential a priori of philosophical anthropology. But this is not the aim of our investigation, right? We are not going to get into a full subjectivity, right? Its aim is that, again, of fundamental ontology. So if we inquire into being in thematically, we cannot be willing to nullify the primordiality of the phenomena by deriving it. It should not be derivative, right, of others, that is, by an inappropriate analysis in the sense of dissolving it. But the fact that we cannot derive something primordial does not exclude a multiplicity of characteristics of being constitutive for it. If these characteristics show themselves, they are existentially equiprimordial. The phenomena of the equiprimordiality of constitutive factors have also been disregarded in ontology on account of a methodologically unrestrained tendency to derive everything and everything from a primordial ground. So again, he's trying to go to this Abgrund, right, to the abyssal plane to work this through in terms of the there-ness, right? In which direction? We get the answer to this question by recalling what we're charged with keeping in view phenomenologically when we pointed out this phenomena. Being in contradistinction to the objectively present, which is grounded. Again, the scientific project, the principle of reason, sufficient reason, right? Calculated rationality, and of course, what is objectively present, right? Remember this, again, it still has the subject-object at work. Right? And he'll go through this to the objectively present, insideness of something objectively present in and other, being in, not as an attribute of the objectively present subject, effected or even just triggered by the objective presence of the world, rather being in essentially as the kind of being of this being itself. But what else then presents itself with this phenomena other than the objectively present commercium between an objectively present subject and an objectively present object? This is Descartes. This interpretation would come closer to the phenomenal content if it stated the Dasein is the being of this in-between, between the subject and the object. Nonetheless, the orientation towards the between would be misleading. Why? Because it colludes, unaware, with the ontologically indefinite approach that there are beings between which this between as such is. Right? It is distorting the is, right? The predicate. Right? The predication. The is itself. The detour. Right? The between is already understood as the result of a conventiata of two objectively present things. But this, and there is no prospect of ever putting it back together from the fragments. Not only do we lack the cement, but we also lack the schema, according to which this joining together to be accomplished has been split apart or never as yet unveiled. What is ontologically decisive is to avoid splitting the phenomena beforehand, that is, to secure its positive phenomenal content. The fact that extensive and complicated preparations are necessary for this only shows that something ontically self-evident in the traditional treatment of the problem of knowledge was ontologically distorted in many ways to the point of it becoming invisible. He's showing it's impossible for us to have knowledge of this because it was ontologically distorted from the beginning. Right? It's been veiled. Right? It's been hidden. It's been undisclosed, right? Okay? So you cannot be both within and in and the outside. He's looking at the inside and the outside here, vis-a-vis the old subject-object, and we are not, the who is not the between the subject and object. So we have this distortion that has gone on for a very long time that produced this Western metaphysics. Again, a kind of preliminary destruction, if you will, of the tradition. So the being, which is essentially constituted by being in the world, is itself always, it's there. So you're just not Sein, Dasein. You have to have the there-ness of the being. That's who we are. So we don't really think of ourselves as place, right? Or as there, but this is crucial. The there-ness. Right? So there and where become crucial determinations here. Yep. Godard did a very interesting film about Palestine in the early 70s called Here and There. And the here was in Paris, looking at footage on TV, and the there was the actual fighting of the PLO. Kind of interesting, the way he used this terminology.
What movie was that?
Here and There.
Here and There.
Yeah.
Great.
So this is interesting. This is good because this is on the, if you want, under our own thematic of orientation. You know, this is a book about orientation. The politics is about orientation, right? Right. According to the familiar meaning of the word there, points to here and over there. The here of I here is always understood in terms of an over there at hand, in the sense of being toward it, which it de-distances and is directional, and it takes care. You know, these two moments, right? And remember the multiple meanings of the term Sinn in German, right? The sense, the directionality, and the meaning, right? Where we talked about this, right? Earlier. The existential spatiality of Dasein, which determines its place for it in this way, is itself based upon being in the world. The over there is the determinateness of something encountered within the world. Here and over there are possible only in a there. That is, when there is a being which, as the being of the there, has disclosed spatiality. Okay? And this is why it's such a pain to go through this Cartesian space. Right? Again. Right? This being bears in its own most being the character of not being closed off, or foreclosed, if you will, Arto, Unverschlossenheit. The expression there means this essential disclosedness, and through disclosedness, this being is there for itself together with the there being of the world. Okay? So now he's getting into this aletheia, right? Disclosed and undisclosedness, right? Veiling and unveiling.
Okay.
This is part of the interpretation, because the there always points to a here and an over there, right? Now, simultaneous, as I mentioned last week, multiple registers are at work in each paragraph. Another register here is this positive destruction, right, of ontology. When we talk in an ontologically figurative way about the natural light in human being, and that's directly from Descartes. That's the end of part 1 of the discourse on the method in human being. We mean nothing other than the existential ontological structure of this being. The fact that it is in such a way as to be its there. To say that it is illuminated means that it is cleared in itself as being in the world, not by another being, but in such a way that it is itself the clearing, the Lichtung, the lighting. Only for a being thus cleared existentially do objectively present things be accessible in the light or concealed in darkness. By its very nature, Dasein brings its there along with it. If it lacks its there, it is not only factically not, but in no sense the being which is essentially Dasein. Dasein is its disclosedness. Okay? So you can see the little thing at the bottom. Dasein exists and it alone, right? Thus existence is standing out. To exist really means to stand out. You're outstanding.
that in itself is a radical statement.
Very
to
radical.
The mediocrity of the average. Right?
Yes, of
Because
course.
That's Nietzsche too.
Of
Like,
course, yeah.
To be outstanding simply means to exist.
Yes.
And if you don't,
Most people don't.
then you don't exist.
This is part of the problem. This is the culture of mediocrity
It's the
at
culture
work.
of mediocrity.
It's the
You're
culture of
encouraged to
mediocrity.
blend in.
You're encouraging this. The institutions continually play with this. This is what they want in order to continue functioning the way they are. So there's a lot of radical potential here, you know, both in thought and in practice, you know, when you begin to think about this, right? To exist means to be outstanding, to stand out, right? Does not mean to be interiorized, sitting there, nodding your stupid head, you know, yes, yes, yes. You know, the Nietzsche used to go, the hee-haw of the donkey, you know, right, etc. Yes. So there's a very different stake at work
enduring,
here.
but there's also
right,
enduring.
Right.
Right? So the ability of...
When Rachel goes to ask for a raise, she's going to say, I exist. I'm outstanding. Right? Tell
And
the
I
boss,
endure.
and you don't. Right? Just sign here, as my uncles used to tell the women in the family in the old Greek patriarchy. Sign here at every funeral, you know. Anyway. Okay, so this is very important. I mean, I want you, this is why I'm reading this, and I want to focus on this introduction. I know it's a long section, but again, there's density here upon density, and
It's
you know,
very dense,
and
yeah.
it's very, it's not only the complicatedness, but it's really interesting how he's working on so many registers at once. You know, he continues his attack upon the Cartesian spatiality, upon time-space together. You know, he'll say this about Bergson later. He'll take on this French tradition, and one way of reading this, too, in the history of philosophy, would be from Descartes to Bergson in terms of space, not only in terms of time. Okay? So that's another thing, and that just came to me, but I can see this now. Yeah. Okay? So we must set forth the Constitution, you know, and when he uses Constitution, you know what that means. That's the, you know, the essential constitution, the constitutive elements of this being. But since the nature of this being is existence, your standing out is your nature, the existential statement that the design is its disclosedness means the being about which this being is concerned in its being is it's there. So it's no longer standpoint, right? It's there, right? So location, right? But in terms of place, and place, right? This is what's going on here. It's a kind of topology, I want to emphasize again, which it is to be. In addition to characterizing the primary constitution of the being of disclosure, we must, in accordance with the character of our analysis, interpret the kind of being in which this being is, it's there in an everyday way. So we're going to go back to everydayness now through the dot, right? So this chapter, and you know, you probably read, I don't need to read this, but anyway, underlines the explication of being in as such, that is the being of the there. So being and such, or when you say as such as a Heideggerian, you literally mean it's being there, being in there, right? The being of the there. And this has two parts. The existential constitution of the there, right? And then the everyday being and its entanglements. And this is a great word too, you know, entanglements. You know, I mean, some people like ensnarements, but the good thing about entanglement, you can disentangle. You know, uninsnare or desnare is not a great term to be using. But yes, he's talking about us being both entangled in terms of our everyday relations and how this works out, and then how do you disentangle from this. Right? So we see the two constitutive ways to be there in attunement. One is one is attunement and one understanding. Their analysis gives the phenomenological confirmation through an interpretation of a concrete mode, which is important for the subsequent problematic. So he has two parts, as you can remember, right? A is through attunement to language and discourse and understanding, and then part B, right, is the everyday being and the entanglement. And then it's interesting because he's going to use three categories, such as idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity as the everyday being of the there. So gossip, rumor, right, spectacle, all of this is going to come under this section, part B, the everyday being of the there and entanglements, right, in some ways, right? And then ultimately the falling prey, the entanglements, right, the verfallen, which I called falling prey, right, and leading to prey to something, as in the addictogenic society, a movement which is existentially its own. So this is basically the sketch, right, if you will, the first sketch of what he's going to do in this chapter, which is, I think, a very important chapter because he's going to go give, language, moods, affects, and all this. Now, I know we read some of attunement. Now, let's go back to your question about relevance and signs, because, and tell me where you want to start in section 18 on this.
Well, no, it's a footnote, actually, in chapter, in the section 31.
Oh, it's in 31, the section, okay.
No, 30. He says, existing being in the world as such is disclosed for the sake of which, and we have called this disclosedness understanding. So, understanding has a footnote, it goes back to section 18. I just thought, to really have the idea of understanding, since I was a little bit confused by that section.
Okay.
Which is, signs and reference. Right, isn't that where he sort of explicates the idea of understanding?
I mean, that's one time of it, but I mean, it's not. Section 8. His understanding is really becoming is much deeper here. So if you look at the top of, let's kind of take this from the top, right?
Okay.
So he's gone through attunement and fear as a mode of attunement, right? Up to this point. And he gets to design as understanding. And you can see that moods, right, disclosedness of world, circumspection, all these things are happening, etc. And then he goes into hermeneutics on page 135. I want to preface this so we don't get too far afield.
We don't have to go there yet.
No, it's okay. I'm doing this, to lead up to the understanding.
Okay.
So, he says, page 135, and this is very, very important.
What
that,
section?
I'm sorry, section 30. This is 30. 29. Back in 29.
Oh, section 29.
29, and this is on about 12 paragraphs in. Aristotle's rhetoric must be understood as the first systematic hermeneutic of the everydayness of being with one another, right? So we have to be in a world, right? Being in as such, being in a world, right? Then being in a world, right, with one another, and publicness is the being of the they. He's going to go back to this, by the way, dictatorship of the they, right, of the they and the they self, right? He's going to go back to this, all right? So anyway, the speaker speaks to this. So, I'm sorry?
It's a good section.
Yes, it's a great section, yeah. So, publicness, right, etc. Then he goes on to say, Aristotle's rhetoric must be understood as the first systematic hermeneutic of the everydayness of being with another. And then he goes through these levels of being with another about entanglements, right? The existential constitution of evasion, right? Enthronedness. And remember, look, we're going through this category, and if you go to your map that I gave you, you'll have this section. You'll see how it's interrelated. Right? So you have, again, let me put this on the board. Because I think it's good to preface this with So this is where we are on the diagram, right? We're being in, right? Okay? So hopefully this helps, going forward, right? So we're being in, and chapter 29, where we were just reading from attunement and fear as a mode, right? 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 We're also then going to go to, and this is the section we will go and compare to 18 that you're referring to, Josh, to reference enzymes.
Right.
Okay? So we're going to go back there in a minute, right? But I want us to see this. And being in also has, the project we were talking about earlier, right? And of course, circumspection. And we're doing that a little bit with the scene, right? And then we have, of course, with language, we have read speech, right? Disclosedness, uncovering, right? This is all happening being in a world, right? Uncovering language, and it's going to be projected out all the way to one of the sections here, idle talk, ambiguity, and curiosity. Right? Going to have this here. What this becomes is an everyday modality, right? Right? This is part of the everyday, right? This is actually your existentialia. This is your outstandingness, if you want to think about it that way now. Okay? It's good sometimes, these diagrams, because they get us going in a different way. So this, and the major thing here is fear. And if you read that stuff carefully, I think section 29, you can begin to see the therapy that Heidegger is, what a great symptomatologist he is, through attunement and fear as a mode of attunement. It is really interesting when you begin to, think deeply about this, how it basically is connected to everyday life in our own, gyrations, variations, vicissitudes, and all these kind of things. So this is a very important part to my mind, and eventually, you will see this, going out to what we talked about earlier, thrownness, and our having beenness, and our future, right? These are part of our futures, right? These are our futures, right? Our facticity, right? Right? Not our factuals, right? And our existentialia, and how we're thrown. Now the thrownness is the there. And I know Chris and I have had this discussion and some other things. The Mallarmé. Every revolution is a throw of the die. Contingency. So in this attunement, you always have the contingent. Or, better put, for our purposes, precarity. We are precarious. Always already precarious. In our attunement, etc. Right? Okay, good so far. I mean, I'm trying to, give it this kind of a wholeness, right?
Attunement is a good in the between the two translations, a good example of what I was talking about before. In this, it's state of mind. So you get the idea of what attunement is.
Oh yeah, that's right. I remember they used state of mind because we used to talk about.
But this one is
states
attunement
of mind in the early '70s, and yeah.
Attunement seems more powerful.
Yeah,
it's much more
subtle.
powerful.
It's more
subtle.
subtle.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, and really,
It's all of your senses,
another
not just the mind.
translation too
Yeah.
of this would be determinativeness. How one is determined, how one is situated in one's determinativeness.
Also has some
as well.
sense of movement too.
Yes,
state of mind
that's
is
right.
very static.
Well, this is the movement.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
The early
Interesting.
movement. And as you know, if you're looking at the chart, this goes out to the everyday of indifference, right? You can become indifferent without affect because of the attunement, right? This is a very crucial section, I think. 29 is very crucial in terms of an understanding of, what one can do with existential, if you will, psychoanalysis for lack of a better term. That's Sartre's term, but I don't know if we can, or design analysis, to use Leonard Boss's term. Right? It's very powerful if you begin to think about this. What do you do with a patient that's psychotic? You have to enter that world. You have to look at the there of that psychosis. You want to begin to look at that there-ness, the thrownness, right? What's going on, right? You enter into the world. And these case histories, if you're interested in this, one of the best case histories is the case of Ellen West by Ludwig Binswanger. She was not cured, but it was a great understanding of her situation. Another great attempt.
She started to enjoy it.
I would have taken her for a walk. Right. Anyway. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, right. Exactly. It's much better than being inside the doctor's office. Breathe, dear. Yeah. How did that feel? Yeah. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. Right. Anyway. But yeah. So again, to go back here, we always have to think we are thrown into precarity, contingency, right? With this having been, this, right, as well. So you have the futural and the past working together, always.
Contingency is, it could be or it could not be.
Well, possibility is higher than actuality.
Okay.
You always have to remember what Heidegger's always trying to do is stay within the possibility, right? He's always thinking the possibility,
Okay.
So this is why he has so many levels here. The existentialia, the traits, the derivatives, right? This is explains some of the language, right? It's being, used here. The everyday moralities, the characteristics, right? All of these things are playing out. So we're getting a descriptive phenomenology here, but at the same time we're getting a very, different kind of phenomenology that is being interpreted under the horizon of time. So think of this as that you're going through many, many levels of reduction to get to that there-ness. Right? Okay?
I think so.
You think so? Okay,
Yeah, no,
well, it's
I get it.
okay. I
That's
mean,
good.
you let me know. But look at this here. This here is interpretation,
Yeah.
which is crucial. These are always, as Dasein, the inquiry, the level here is always interpretation, right? In conjunction with this, leading ultimately towards, right, of course, interpretation and understanding. We're going to go towards the understanding. See, underneath this, as you see, the self, the subject, if you will, is always in existence, right? And in this existence, the standing out is taking place. And that disclosedness can be authentic or inauthentic. We'll get to that later, but this is another aspect. So, again, listen, I know it's difficult, but you have to try to keep holding, if you can, hold the register of the phenomenological destruction of ontology that's going on, a description of there-ness, a descriptive phenomenology of the there, right? And then the being of the there in its characteristics and its existentiality, right? You're looking at this. And then third, also being interpreted in terms of the horizon of time.
Okay.
These registers. If you can keep this in mind as you're reading this, you begin to see it. Right? I mean, in some ways, it's a kind of tripart, reading of different types of registers. Right? Okay? I mean, that's not going to get rid of your anxiety, but it will. It may heighten it. It may heighten it. Make you see more.
The fear is
right. Yeah. Well, fear is not the anxiety. That's just the interesting part. The fear has an object. Fear is still very ontic, in a way. Yeah. I mean, angst is too, but angst has no object. This is the interesting thing.
Angst has no object.
Has no object. Nothing.
It's floating anxiety.
No,
That's
that's
the problem.
Americanism.
That's the problem, right? That it
The
doesn't
problem
have an object.
has no
We don't
object.
we don't know how to grasp it.
We don't grasp it. We
Exactly.
cannot grasp death. We can experience, the limits of mortality.
We will.
We will experience it ultimately, right? It's good to stay in that position, I think. It keeps you, grounded and focused, if you will, or in the abyssal plane where you can dance a little bit, which is good, because dancing over the abyss seems to be the Nietzschean moment in all of this, in some ways. But this has no object, whereas fear has objects. You have a fear of snakes. You have a fear of place. You have a fear of, that person, etc. But the anxiety is a very different thing. Yep, very different. Yeah. So the German word for fear is, and I'm going to look this up too. I'm going to look this up to see what Heidegger's using. He's not. I don't think he's using angst until we get to being towards death. Right. So I'm gonna go back to section 18. I haven't forgotten.
No, that's all right.
Yeah. Right.
I mean,
What do you figure about another hour, or it's up to you guys? I mean,
was it?
it's 4:30.
Yeah.
What, is that good or later? No, I'm just asking. I mean, I'm just asking. So okay, go to the bathroom. I'll wait till you get back before I go there. Yeah. It's right across the hall.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, this is a beautiful passage. Page 135, Chris, I'm sorry, sort of the end of 29. It's about, it's a second to last paragraph of 29. It begins, attunement is an existential, fundamental way in which Dasein is its there. Okay, this is why this is a very crucial part to me, again. Attunement is an existential, bottom of the page, Phil, 135. Yeah. Attunement is an existential, fundamental way in which Dasein is its there. It not only characterizes Dasein ontologically, but is at the same time a fundamental methodological significance of the existential analytic because of its disclosure. Like every ontological interpretation in general, the analytic can only listen in, beautiful, so to speak, on beings already previously disclosed with regard to their being. How's that for surveillance, Arta? Like every ontological interpretation in general, the analytic can only listen in, so to speak, on beings already previously disclosed with regard to their being.
Yeah. Surveillance, wiretap, listening in.
Right. And it will keep to the eminent disclosive possibilities of Dasein of the widest scope in order to gain from them information about this being. The phenomenological interpretation must give to Dasein itself the possibility of primordial disclosure and let it, so to speak, interpret itself. Right? It goes along with its disclosure only in order to raise the phenomenal content of disclosure existentially to a conceptual level. Very important. With regard to the later interpretation of such an analytic, and he will talk about ontological basic attunement, anxiety, the problem of attunement will be demonstrated more concretely as the definite mode of fear. Okay? So what goes along? And he goes through 6 levels of the fear, the relevant nature of harmfulness, the definite range which can be affected by it, the region known as something which is unnerving, something threatening, harmful, but not near enough to be dealt with, but coming near. The approaching occurs within nearness. Something must be harmful in the highest degree and coming nearer, but still far off, it's veiled. Yeah, the can, and yet in the end it may not, gets worse. And then means what is harmful, approaching near, bears the revealed possibility of not happening and passing us by. That does not lessen or extinguish fearing, but enhances it, even if it doesn't happen. So the possibility of all these things, right, as a mode. Yeah. Okay.
we're analyzing what we are afraid of,
Yes.
fearing, and that about which.
Yes. That before which.
That about which.
And that about which. Right.
So the that about is different than the
Yes.
what.
Yes.
Okay.
So fear always has an object. It
The-
may
the
be
what.
vague,
Yeah.
but it has a whatness to it.
Right.
Anxiety does not have a whatness.
That's the that about is anxiety.
Well, anxiety has nothingness is at the bottom of, it reveals nothingness,
Okay.
right? Okay, let me go back to this 18. So world is always there. So what do you want to the thing? Tell me what the question's about here.
I forgot.
So, I'm sorry. So I was successful in displacing that one. Huh? Right.
Hold on.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess just the overview of this chapter then is, I think we were sort of relating it as the sort of semiotics, his version of semiotics, essentially, right?
Well, I mean, ultimately it is kind of in terms of signs, etc., right? Relational totalities. You can see page 85 is really what the footnote is about.
Okay.
Right? If you turn to page 85, third paragraph down, this is in section 18, Chris.
Oh, understanding, yeah.
Yeah. Understanding, which will be analyzed with proper penetration in what follows, compare section 31, right, holds the indicated relations in a preliminary disclosure. So semiotics, signs, and what has referential relevance is preliminary, right, to understanding, right?
Yes, okay.
Okay, so it's kind of the before-handedness of before we begin to see this relational totality, right? And then we begin to go on to understanding in a much deeper way, right? So, in its familiar being and relevance, understanding holds itself before that disclosure as that within which its reference moves. Understanding can itself be referred to in and by these relations. This being and relevance, right? And the relations, right, in which it moves, right? We call this relational characters signifying, right? These referential ways signifying. In its familiarity with its relations, design signifies to itself. It primordially gives itself to understand its being and its potentiality being with regard to its being in the world. The forsake of which signifies a functional, I think I went through some of this functional stuff, right? Yeah. Signifies an in order to, the in order to signifies a what for, right? The what for signifies a what in and letting something be relevant. And the latter a what with of the relevance. These relations are interlocked themselves in a primordial, as a primordial totality.
Okay.
They are not what they are in this signifying which Dasein gives to itself to understand its being in the world beforehand. So this is kind of like having a pre-understanding of things, right?
Okay. That
is already within us. So you're really dealing here, if you want to look at this paragraph, you want to mark this is really the notion of the pre-understanding in some way. Yeah.
Okay.
The pre-scientific, if you will, in Althusser. This is interesting if you want to compare to Althusser's notion of the scientific, the pre-scientific. So just take any object and try to apply it to this. If you want to look at the microphone or the hammer he uses a lot, the broken hammer is another thing of his, but the hammer. Its function, its givenness, etc. And again, he uses this term, letting be, right? And this is Heidegger's way of freeing up a horizon. You let things be in the world as they are, right? You not only just grab it, right, to take it, you let it be to see what its relational totality is, right? You begin to take on a new world, new attitude, if you will, or a new set of well, that's a bad word, a new set of, if you will, attunements, in a sense, to the things in the world that you encounter.
Right, okay.
Okay? So you have this kind of almost pre-intuitive, right? I mean, pre-understanding of both reference, relevance, and signification.
Okay.
The signs, right?
I see.
Right? Okay?
Yeah.
So it's like, I'll tell you experience I had once. I was visiting, I went to California, I almost moved to San Francisco. Anyway, I went to go visit, she was a girlfriend who was working in a Cafe Balboa in Pacific Heights. So I go to the restaurant and I'm carrying Roland Barthes' Mythologies. And there's a mandala on the cut. I'm reading it at the bar, waiting for it again. The bartender looks at me and he looks at it and looks good, man. Yeah. I said, yeah, you read it? No, but I got the picture.
Right.
So in a way, he's saying to me,
Yeah.
right, by the sign, right, he has a pre-understanding of what the book's about. Now, this isn't real understanding, of
Right.
course, of the relational totality. Plus, I didn't give him a lecture because I just wanted to get out of there. I was waiting for her to get off from what she used to call smiling for dollars work. Anyway, etc. But it gives you a sense of this, that the signs, right, the mandala, this is the reason I don't like Carl Jung so much. This is almost pre-understanding in terms of the archetypes and what they signify, in a sense. So this is a problem. This is almost, in some ways, he's looking at Platonic form here.
Mm-hmm.
So, you raise a very good point here.
Mm-hmm.
This is the pre-understanding. You could look at this as Platonic ideality of forms, right, etc., that ultimately be played into Jungian archetypes, right, in a sense. Joseph Campbell, someone that, destroyed thinking, in my opinion. The hero with 1,000 faces, right? The masks of, I think he was terrible. I think it was horrible what he did. And you know how many people in academia follow this nonsense and teach this? Yeah.
What is his
Joseph
deal?
Campbell is like pre-Platonic forms that he's using to, talk about the history of archetypes, the hero. He's a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. 25, 30 years ago. Princeton professor. Right. Yeah, big time. Yeah, very big. I had 2 books in the bathroom on the toilet, right? The Ascent of Man by Bronowski, which was a TV program, and the Hero with 1,000 Faces. I hated both. That's why. Yeah.
Beethoven responded like that to a reviewer. He said, he wrote him a letter. He said, I'm reading your review of my symphony. It is in front of me, but soon it will be behind me.
That's good. I like that. That's good. Yeah. So anyway, does this, sort of in a way,
I think so.
or what else, well, So in a sense, right, the, understanding, Dasein, again, he's trying to give us the constitutive features, the next page 86. Significance with which Dasein is always already familiar contains the ontological condition, right, of the possibility, right? So always the possibility that Dasein, as both in understanding and interpreting, where we're going to go, in this, chapter 5, can disclose something akin to significations, which in turn found the possible being of words and language. Okay. By the way, Bedeutungen is usually translated, I don't know why they translated this, can be translated basically as a sense, in some ways, or referential meaning, right, in a sense. So I guess significations is all right. All right. So as for, and again, here we go. As for the existential, again, Josh, he's dealing with the existentials here, right? Right?
I think that's what he's
This is what we are, right? In a way, right? Under an ideal educational system, this could be really developed, right? All these existentials that we have, right? So the constitution of its being in the world, this disclosed significance is the ontic condition of the possibility for discovering a totality of relevance. Right? We thus define the being of what is at hand, relevance, and even worldliness itself as a referential context. We are not volatilizing the substantial being of inner worldly beings into a system of relations, and since relations are always something thought, are we not dissolving the being of inner worldly beings into pure thought? Within the present field of investigation, the repeatedly designated differences of the structures of the ontological problematic are to be fundamentally distinguished. The being, right, of inner worldly beings initially encountered. That's the handiness, the ready to hand. Not the present to hand, right? 2, the being of beings, objective presence that is found and determined by discovering them in their own right and going through the beings initially encountered. And 3, the being of the ontic condition of the possibility of discovering inner worldly beings in general, that is, the worldliness of the world. The third kind of being is the existential determination of being in the world, that is, of design. The other ones are right? Yeah. You understand? I mean, so you have the ready to hand and then the objectively present, right? It's not only with the third until you can get a sense of the relational totality or the referential, context.
Okay.
Right? Always a system of relation. Okay? All right? And then he's going to go on to Descartes. So what he's really trying again here is to distinguish between the ontic and the ontological and keep the ontological inquiry going.
Right.
The fundamental, whereas he sees the other one as part and parcel of a system of metaphysics.
Right.
That you're interpreting through principles. It's kind of almost predetermined in some sense, right?
Right.
The reference itself is predetermined.
Right.
All right? Okay, good.
Okay.
All right. We can go back to it too when we go through. All right. So let's go on to this next section. Again, I think the attunement chapter 29 and 30 are excellent, right? For any kind of sense of what he's really up to vis-a-vis the therapeutic, etc. All right. So. We're going to look at 4 structures now because he's going to talk about Dasein as understanding. Okay, this is section 31. Attunement, page 138, section 31, Chris. Attunement is one of the existential structures in which the being of the there dwells. The being of the there dwells. Equipa primordially. With it, understanding constitutes this being. Attunement always has its understanding only if only by suppressing it. Understanding is always attuned. If we interpret understanding, again, as a fundamental, existential, we see that this phenomena is conceived as a fundamental mode of the being of Dasein. On the other hand, understanding in the sense of one possible kind of cognition among others, distinguished as explaining, must be interpreted, like explaining, as an existential derivative of the primary understanding, which constitutes the being of the there in general. Do you guys understand this? Explain that to me as a derivative kind of question.
Right.
Right? It's a very interesting, right?
Yeah.
How he does this.
Yeah.
And, this is really what's going on in terms of our, understanding. We encountered this primordial understanding earlier, but without explicitly taking up the theme of understanding, a consideration, and this is the section 18, right? To say that Dasein existing is there means world is there. Its Dasein is being in. All crucial categories. World, being in. Being in is there. Then there, da, as that for the sake of which Dasein is. Right? So the 3, right? World is there. Dasein, their being, is being in. And being in is there as for the sake of which Dasein is. Existing being in the world as such is disclosed in the for sake of which, and we call this disclosedness understanding. Right? In understanding, the for sake of which, the significance grounded therein is also disclosed. The disclosure of understanding is that of the for sake of which and of significance, equipped primordially, pertains to the entirety of being in the world. Significance is that for which world as such is disclosed. The statement that the for the sake of which and significance are disclosed in Dasein means that Dasein is a being which, as being in the world, is concerned about itself. Okay? Now, we speak ontically. We use the expression to understand something to mean being able to handle it, being up to it, being able to do something. In understanding as an existential, the thing we are able to do is not a what, but being as existing. The mode of being of Dasein as a potentiality of being lies existentially in understanding. You need understanding in order to have this outstandingness. Dasein is not something objectively present which then has an addition. It's not a supplement, the ability to do something. Rather, it is primarily being possible. Okay? Again, the proposition possibility is higher than actuality. This is always running throughout Heidegger. This is a philosophy of possibility, if you can want to put it into a good, essay about the possible futures. Philosophy of possibility. The essential possibility of Dasein concerns the way of taking care of the world, which we characterized. Remember, concern, and always already present in this, the potentiality of being itself for its own sake. The being possible, which Dasein always is existentially, is also distinguished from empty, and here you go with the logical possibility, and from the contingency of something objectively present, where this or that can happen to it, right? So again, the unions could take good stead from this, in the sense of objectively present is not really what the possible is. You can't say, to Heidegger, you cannot say possible under objective conditions is this.
It's interesting. So is he saying?
It's very interesting. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So the logical possibility is empty because it's not. Precisely because it's not grounded in this dareness, or it may not be grounded in the dareness. That's why it's empty. If you just think logically.
Well, no, the being possible is distinguished from empty logical possibility.
Right, because being possible has this notion of understanding.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
In order to be outstanding, in order to actually.
Right.
Whereas so why is the logic possibility empty? Because it's not concerned with the possible, it's concerned with sort of what the mind can not a priori consider as actual. So logic in this sense deals with only the actual. It is foreclosed to the possible.
Yes. Yes.
Right?
Yes. And he's going on as a modal category. Objective, present. Possibility means what is not yet real and not always necessary. It characterizes which is only possible. Ontological is less than reality and necessity. So again, he's looking at the ontic logical possibility versus the ontologically possible in this context. In contrast, possibility as an existential is the most primordial and the ultimate positive ontological determination of Dasein. As is the case with existentiality, possibility can initially be prepared for solely as a problem. Understanding as a potentiality of being that is disclosive offers the phenomenal ground to see it all. It's not through modal logic, it's not through even dialectical logic that we begin to see the possibilities, right? Or that possibility existentially, right? These are ontic determinations and ontic values that he wants deconstructed, right, in order to get back to the ground of a positive possibility. You know, this is where we are. Positive possibility. Again, this destruction, phenomenologically, right, of the modal logic position, you know, and why he says it's empty, right? Right? Logical possibility, right? Right? So rational choice theory, right, fits into this, right? Rational Marxism, right? You know Ulster and these people, they fit very conveniently into this analytical Marxism. Yeah, Jerry Cohn in the way he does history, very Marxist theory of history. All these people fit very neatly into this, you know, in some ways, right? Right. Possibility as an existential, let's follow this through because this is, again, another crucial part, does not refer to a free-floating potentiality of being in the sense of the liberty of indifference. I like that. As essentially attuned, Dasein has always already got itself into definite possibilities. It's through your attunement. You know, in a way, he's looking at phenomenological attitude, your comportment towards the world, and your attunement. These are the criteria for which your possibilities emerge.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Okay.
Right?
I like
Right?
that.
Okay. As a potentiality for being what it is, it has let some go by. It constantly adopts the possibilities of its being. It grasps it and sometimes fails to grasp it. But this means that Dasein is a being possible which is entrusted to itself. It is thrown possibility throughout. So this category that I put up here and is on your quote, you know, mapping, right, of thrownness, right, is a possibility, always. Again, going back to the die throw. And it is not the liberty of indifference. Some you take and some you don't. Some you grasp and some you don't, in terms of these possibilities. If you're a great gambler, you're able to, again, evaluate all the possibilities, right? This is why people who can count cards aren't allowed at blackjack tables. If you can count 6 or 7 decks, your odds go up about 10% of winning at the table, and the usual odds are 51 to 49% in favor of the house. They go up to well over 60 to 70% if you can count decks of cards, because you know the possibility. Rationally, right? And you're able to grasp that. Now that, of course, is in the horizon of calculated rationality. He's also talking about existentiality, how we live here, right? And the there-ness of our living. But, you know, gambling's part, I mean, you know, this is another aspect, you know. There's something about that that's interesting in terms of chance, games of chance. You know, Hegel used to keep the lottery tickets. He would save them days afterwards, thinking that maybe they would win. What's that?
Rachel's good at the lotto. She wins all the time.
Rachel wins at the lotto.
Yeah.
Right? And tell us this.
$10.
She gets the $20 every week almost.
Should buy Bitcoins.
What do you play?
Powerball.
Just Powerball.
Just Powerball?
Yeah.
And that's the one with the big payoff?
Yeah.
I guess.
But you get small payoffs
Yeah.
too?
Yeah,
You scratch off something? Or
No, you just.
Oh, you just
like,
ask
Pick
them?
the number,
you
and
get
then
the
if
number?
you get the right
Yeah.
number, yeah, they pay you off a little bit.
But I think I just.
I didn't know you had
I think
Harlem connections with the numbers.
I think I just, lose less money than I would somehow.
Yeah, I understand. Okay.
Makes it
But
all
I'm-
back. I don't get mad.
So you're ahead on the lot? You should keep a calculation.
I actually should.
You should.
I'm
You should do
curious
that.
to know.
See if you're ahead of the game.
I could probably figure.
I do this in
started
sports
doing this-
gambling. I'm ahead, but it's kind of like a little hobby, I bet point spreads and
I'll
stuff.
figure out how much
Yeah.
I lost
Yeah,
or
yeah,
made
Yeah.
even.
yeah. Right.
So he defines
So-
design here on the bottom of
Yes, he does. Yeah, I was getting there, but go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Is a being possible,
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
which is entrusted to itself.
Right. And it is thrown, this is the crucial part, you are, as Dasein, thrown possibility.
We're dice.
Yes.
And
Thrown.
that's what makes life interesting. I mean, ultimately, is the
Well, of
suggestion.
course. This is why socialism's boring. If everything's taken care of
plan.
for you.
Yeah, we figured it out.
Yeah.
So this is
Communism
a very radical
wouldn't be,
notion of,
yeah, but it's a very radical notion. Yeah,
of,
go ahead. Yeah.
of life as this aleatory of the encounter. I mean,
Mm. Yes,
Husserl
of
gets
course.
it from here.
Of course. Well, I don't know if he, I
Not
mean,
from here, but
he's certainly
Machiavelli.
thinking about it, and they're coming out of two different traditions.
Yeah.
The aleatory materialism, just to be fair to Louis, yeah, is really out of the Epicurean and Lucretian tradition. You know, it's a materialist tradition of contingent materialism. It goes all the way back to the Epicurean, moment, right? And Democritean is more, static. But the swerve of the atoms, the contingency of the atoms, is part of the, other thing. This is a tradition in philosophy that he does not engage, and most philosophers don't engage, are the early Greek atomists. Marx engaged them in his dissertation, 1841. The difference between the Democritean and Epicurean theories of nature. Right. So to do full justice to Rachel's, lottery tickets, in a sense, we would need to know time of day. We need to know where they are in the wheel, right, et cetera, et cetera. Right.
Wait, so Hegel
He thought, yeah, I don't know, he was probably just, thinking of maybe something strange will happen, who knows. The Ala Minerva, it takes flight after dusk. Think of his metaphors, it takes flight after dusk, right? He may be thinking about, maybe the past will come and I can recapitulate my losses, right? Anyway, so this is very good. The next section, the next definition, of course, Dasein is also the possibility of being free, right, for its own most potentiality of being. Being possible is transparent for it in various possible ways and degrees. Rachel, I'm going to call I'll just stop there, being free. I'm going to call the place. And how many people are going to go to dinner we'll go for 6?
I can't go.
You can't go
No.
tonight? You're going home? Yeah? You sure you don't want to join us?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Nori, Sean, Artos going. Phil, you going to join us? We're going to go in the neighborhood. Okay, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of us, right? Everybody but Chris. You sure you have to go home? You
I
don't
don't
like us
feel
tonight?
well.
You
My
don't feel
back
well?
is
Oh, it's
really
really
bad.
hurting you still? Okay. You taking something though still?
Advil.
That's all?
That works.
The oxycodone made me dizzy.
Okay.
Do
Okay.
you hurt your back?
Yeah. Well, it's been on and off a problem.
I think I hurt myself at Pilates.
Oh, not
Everybody's like,
Because I exercise at all.
Chris
At
too.
home and I
Chris
start,
too,
I get
Rachel.
hurt.
I hurt myself in Pilates too.
But it's a German system. It can't. it's
Probably the
optimized not
instructor
to hurt.
wasn't classical Pilates.
Your pedigree was wrong. What's going on?
I'm just, hi Lionel, it's Michael calling. I'm just wondering if you're at the restaurant, if we can make a reservation
He's calling
for
you
6
on.
o'clock tonight. I'll have, I don't have the number for the restaurant, but I was calling you just in case. Yeah, so we need for 7 people. There's a large group tonight. I guess we'll need more than a booth. Yeah. Okay, so hope to see you soon. Bye-bye. Yeah, I just made the
It's the New
reservation.
Orleans tactics. Like, call the owners.
I don't have the number.
I don't know the Russian.
I don't have the number for the restaurant.
That's true.
Yeah, I don't. I really don't. Rachel has the
Google
number,
doesn't
but I
use
don't
the
have.
No, he doesn't have that.
I don't have
It's
any
better.
of that stuff. You just call the owner. It's better. Yeah.
He calls him back. This has happened before.
Yes. He'll call me back if he gets the message. I don't know. I should. Oh, he says you don't text. I better text him. So he always makes a comment about that. You don't text. So I better text him.
Yeah, we need to bring chocolate. That's true.
What about
As
chocolate?
radical as you can get.
I mean, we don't have to go there. I mean,
If we can, we should.
okay.
I don't know if we can.
No, they'll make room. Table for 7. Stupid old phone, but anyway.
See this, Rachel? This is bookmark. I went around with my scissors trying to find something I could cut in the warehouse. I found that.
Why? Because you wanted.
Bookmarks.
Rachel, I may have to ask you to call them just in case if he doesn't reply. But you know, this guarantees it. You know, that's why I did it. But yeah, let's see.
Call him up.
I can keep going. I can step outside.
Tell Michael already called me now.
Yeah, I'd say that.
As for Charlotte.
Show up.
Yeah, she's the barmaid. Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. So it's really hurting, huh?
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to leave soon.
Okay. Yeah.
Sucks.
You know, no stretching. You tried what I mean, this stuff works for me.
I have a few
You do?
exercises that I can do, but I haven't been doing them.
Well, that's Chris. Dasein does not come to you. You know?
I have a
Dasein
mat.
is you.
I have to lie on the mat and do exercises that, you know, my legs go one way and then my legs go another way. And
Maybe there's someone here at physical therapy.
Oh yeah, you want me to get you someone? I tell the student I give them an A if they can fix you up.
Yeah, that's rough.
Yeah.
yeah, that's right. This is physical therapy. This area.
There's a table right there if you want to lie down. Right there. They have all the equipment right there.
I got it at 6 o'clock.
Oh, wow.
Oh, good. Okay,
Right.
fantastic. Good.
Cafe Paulette?
Yeah. So we'll have 4 seats for 14. We'll have a table for 14. Good. All right. So very good definition here. So then he goes on to understanding, this is page 140, still there, is the being of such a potentiality of being which is never still outstanding as something not yet objectively present, but as something essentially never objectively present, is together with the being of Dasein in the sense of existence. The crucial thing here is together with the being of Dasein in the sense of outstandingness or existing. Dasein is in the way that in each case it understands, or alternatively has not understood, to be in this or that way. As this understanding, it knows what is going on, that is, what its potentiality of being is. This knowing does not first grow out of immanent self-perception, but belongs to the being of the there, again, which is essentially understanding. And only because Dasein is its there, understandingly, can it go astray and fail to recognize itself. And since understanding is attuned, and attunement is existentially surrendered to thrownness, Dasein has always already gone astray and failed to recognize itself. In its potentiality of being is thus delivered over to the possibility of first finding itself again in its possibilities. So even if you're off the beaten track, you know, and this is very much, I mean, for those of you that read Zarathustra of Nietzsche, it's about the convalescent who folds back into oneself, you know, after a long period. This is what convalescence really means, Chris. Yeah. You know, so you can go home and convalesce and fold back into your true self. Yeah.
Actually, Nietzsche described people who pore over books and
That's true.
bend over.
That's true.
And it,
But look, you know, when you bend over a lot, you're going to bend backwards too. It goes
Yeah.
without saying. And you know, when you're like this, and a physical therapist taught me, you put your hand out like this and you hold it all day. Yeah, right. And you stretch out this way, you're going to start getting a whole new sense of, instead of
wow.
like this, you get a whole new, you figure what muscles are being locked. You know, I learned stuff in Montreal. You know,
Dialectic.
when I go up, yeah. Right, yeah, dialectics and French.
Pilates is very dialectical.
Yeah, I'm sure, yeah.
Very.
Sure. Yeah,
If
yeah.
you
So,
have-
you know, try, yeah.
No, but if you have pain or tightness in one muscle, it's because the other one on the other side is too weak. And
Yes,
so it's,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's just it's a very, I mean, almost, I mean, I don't like this word, commonsensical, but it is kind of a reverse sense of what you're doing. That's the boss. See?
It's undermining.
Oh, no, it's not undermining.
Different boss.
It's someone else.
Oh,
Yeah.
well,
yeah.
I'm just saying it's
Yeah,
undermining.
Yeah. No, it's not him, it's someone else. It's the head of the Marxist Education Project. Different understanding. So listen, have a very nice holiday if we don't see
Okay,
you.
Chris.
And is there anything, I mean, are you able to get to the subway okay, or?
yeah.
Oh,
If I-
that's the.
if I can
Hi,
It's under
Leonel,
my
we got a reservation.
You want a hand?
Yeah.
We did, we got it, yeah,
It's
I
under
just
Rachel.
figured, it's under Rachel, so we're gonna be there at 6. I thank you very much. We'll see you then. Okay, okay, great. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye, take care, thank you. The boss. See, they called back. Not long, see?
Yeah, that's all.
Yeah.
Sorry, Chris.
Chris, I got good pills if you wanna, I mean, I can run home.
What kind of pills?
Here we go, falling prey, here. I mean, I do have some painkillers. I mean, why, you ran out, or?
No, I don't want to take your painkillers.
No, I don't have any pain right now. So I don't need,
So they don't need to kill anything.
I don't need to kill any pain. Yeah, I have different kinds of pain, but they're not that kind of pain.
Weltschmerz.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
All right, so
Okay.
you have, all the best, and we'll be in touch. And I had, I read something on white today, and a very
great.
good book. So I'll be
Send
in
me an
touch
email.
about that, I will.
Okay.
And I hope you get down, if you're gonna be writing, stretch back. I know you have to, continue with the piece, that's the deal.
Okay.
All right, okay.
All right,
Thank
bye,
you.
Chris.
Bye.
You know, it's interesting. My dad's
Yeah.
a doctor. She's pretty creative in this. She's read philosophy. She said that the simple act of lifting weights,
Yes,
like building muscle,
right,
literally produces molecules that boost the immune system against cancer.
of course.
Like literally the
Really?
simple
Of
acts
course.
like lifting.
You
like
should
the
always have
mind-body
dumbbells
connection.
at home for 15 minutes a day, or do something like that.
So apparently just
And walking, yeah.
Is good for.
Yeah,
It's a
that's
form
right.
of the body, like
Absolutely.
self-healing.
I mean, you're crafting as well, that too. I mean, that's a there-ness of the body. I mean, he doesn't really talk, there's not a section on this, why a lot of people went to Nietzsche more, and certainly, Freud in terms of these, giant thinkers. But, in a way, yes, it's absolutely right. And, yeah.
He lived a long life.
Who?
The little paths.
Heidegger. Oh, yeah, of course. Oh, you can see him and move quickly, too.
Through the Black Forest.
Yeah, through the Black Forest. Right. Interesting. All right, let's go on for a few minutes, and we got a little bit of time. Yeah. I mean, so anyway, only because Dasein is it's there, understanding can go astray and fail to recognize. Since understanding is attuned, and attunement, and this is good, is existentially surrendered to thrownness, right? Existentially surrendered to thrownness. Dasein has always already gone astray and failed to recognize itself. So we're sort of thrown into this kind of inauthenticity, if you will, right? We're kind of thrown into errancy, to having been seduced and been gone astray, right? It's interesting the way he does this, right? In a sense, we're not really born, premature, predetermined, or, in a way, this takes away, too, for class defining everything, in some senses, or the standard definitions of class, some way, right? So, in its potentiality, being is thus delivered over to the possibility of first finding itself again in its possibilities. And the old Christian stuff, and Augustine says, you must be lost before you can be found, right? This is certainly a play on that, right? In a deeper way,
Sure.
right? All right. So, understanding, then, italicized, is the existential being of the ownmost potentiality. Ownmost, crucial word here. Proper to oneself. In such a way that this being discloses in itself what its very being is about. The structure of this existential must be grasped more precisely. So now he's going to go through the structure, the existential structures, and again, if you go back to the diagram, you can see the existentiality, how it's constituting everything, right? And we're going to get into understanding and interpretation, right? And now thrownness and facticity, into multiple levels of project, right? And direction. Okay? As disclosing, understanding. So understanding has many components here. Again, not just we understand, as we say, or I hear you. As disclosing, you can tell the brothers next time they say, I hear you. Is that as disclosing? Or, anyway. Right. Always concerns the whole fundamental constitution of being in the world. As a potentiality of being in is always a potentiality of being in the world. Not only is the world, qua world, disclosed in its possible significance, but inner-worldly beings themselves are freed, and they're freed for their possibilities, their own possibilities. What is at hand is discovered as such in its servability, its usability, its detrimentality. The totality, and here's going back to what you were talking, of relevance reveals itself as the categorical whole of a possibility of the nexus of things at hand. All the connections, right?
Okay.
But the unity, too, of manifold presence, nature, is discoverable only on the basis of the disclosedness of one of its possibilities.
Nature, manifold
Yes.
presence.
Yes. Yes. Is it a matter of chance that the question of the being of nature aims at the conditions of its possibility? Or what is this questioning, on what is this question is based? It cannot miss the question, why are beings, unlike design, understood in their being if they are disclosed in terms or the conditions of their possibility? Kant presupposed something like this, perhaps correctly so, but this presupposition itself cannot be left without demonstrating how it's justified. Okay? And, in a way, the understanding and the critique of pure reason is also at stake here. He's also riffing off of this, and in terms of Kant, what is the Kantian understanding. And what Kant does, he tries to merge both sensibility and understanding into a unity, a transcendental unity. All right, anyway, let's go back to this. Why does understanding always penetrate into possibilities from among the essential dimensions of what can be disclosed to it? Because understanding has the existential structure in it, which we call project, or project. It projects the being of design just as primordially upon its for the sake of which is upon significance as the worldliness of this particular world. Project character of understanding constitutes being in the world with regard to the disclosedness of its being there as the there of a potentiality of being. Important next sentence. Project is the existential constitution in the being in the realm of factical potentiality of being. When Marx says the revolution is dead, long live the revolution, this is it. Right? And as thrown, Dasein is thrown into the mode of the being of projecting. Projecting has nothing to do with being related to a plan thought out, according to which design arranges its being, but as design it has always already projected itself and is, as long as it is itself, as it is, lives, right, projecting. As long as it is, design has always understood itself and will understand itself in terms of possibilities. Furthermore, the project character of understanding means that understanding does not thematically grasp that upon which it projects, namely possibilities themselves. Such a grasp precisely takes its character possibility away from what is projected. It degrades it to the level of a given, intended content, whereas in projecting, project throws possibility before itself as possibility, and as such lets it be. As projecting, understanding is the mode of being of design in which it is its possibilities as possibilities. So we have disclosedness as understanding, understanding as project together. And project is always about the factical potentiality of being, right? Project itself, right? Yeah, and understanding, right? Always the possibilities. Because of this kind of being, which is constituted by the existential of projecting, design is constantly more than it actually is. Right? This is always good, you know? Always more than it actually is. Assuming that one wanted to, and if one could, give an inventory of it as something objectively present. But that's not the case. It is never more than it factically is, because its potentiality of being belongs essentially to its facticity. But as being possible, design is always, also nevertheless. It is existentially that which it is not yet in its potentiality of being. And only because the being of there gets its constitution through understanding and its character of project, only because it is, what it becomes or does not become, can it say, understanding of itself, become what you are. And that's Nietzsche speaking, by the way. Yeah. Yeah. You become what you are. Right? And going back to Introduction to Metaphysics, you can see the old philosophical problematic, and this also goes out in the Science of Logic of Hegel, is the being and becoming. Right? So this is really an attempt to look at become at what you are. Yeah? And this, in a way, is Nietzsche will talk about, you know, this whole notion of facticity, and in fact, Nietzsche talks about this.
Where was this in Nietzsche?
It doesn't say Nietzsche. I'm saying that. I'm giving you another footnote. Become, yeah. Become what you are. Yeah. And that's based on things. So for Nietzsche, it's the love, the amor, fatum, loving of the facticity. You know, love your having beenness and move with it. And then he translates that to amor fati, love your destiny. Right? Love your fate.
So the human, this is the root of radical politics, in the sense that we are born sort of as nothing, but we have the possibility to become. That's open. Right? So the notion of, and that's sort of Nietzsche's...
Well, again, the facticity here, the having beenness, is part of that possibility going forward.
That's always latent. It's always there.
Yes, always already there. Right, always there. The
But it
there
can be
is the important.
foreclosed.
Again, this is a, you know, I know it means something different in Russian, but the da is always there.
Da means the affirmative.
Yes,
in Russian.
yes. So the this, yes, and the there in a certain way is working.
Because it exists.
Yes.
It's there.
Right. But you're always dealing
And
with
the
this.
opposite would be the negate, the absence of.
Yes.
The no.
I mean, you know, and again, Heidegger is going to play on presence and absence, that presence of the facticity and becoming is playing out, or it's absent. You know? Okay? So in revolutionary politics, you could think of this in terms of, you know, what has been, right? How we review all the time successful, you know, if you want to measure revolutions, right? we think in terms of what has been, what has worked, etc. But at the same time, we need to kind of have that rupture, right, in order to become outside of that problematic. Although initially we're always framed in the there-ness of that facticity of the past and that historicality, right? Okay? So we're always in this movement of futures past instead of just the future open horizon. Okay? If you can understand this, I mean, this is a kind of different temporality of futures past, right? Futures hyphen past. It's the hyphen that's important, right? For the becoming, right? So when you think of your future, you're always thinking of what has been, right? And I don't mean in the sense of the objective resume and all this nonsense, or what you've done on the job. You know, I'm talking about what you have been, right? Including missed opportunities and possibilities as well, right? They may not have been taken, they might not have been grasped, but that is still there, right? In terms of the becoming, the future. This is all going on in terms of existentiality, you know, existential as being outstanding, standing outside of oneself. So depression in a certain way, seems to me, I mean, depression in some ways, is that people begin to become so introverted or introspective, which terms I don't like, but they become so inward, if you will, right, that they miss any of that outstandingness of what could be, right, the becoming, etc., and the future becomes foreclosed because of that. And that to me seems to be part of the source of depression, you know, or at least what a depressive position encounters is a foreclosure of the future. I mean, what our union's going, a bunch of zombies at the meeting on Tuesday. Zombies.
Not outstanding.
Zombies. Nobody's existing. Instanding
They're not
is good.
existing.
Instantiations. I'm going to start calling them. Yes, right.
Can you imagine if you said that?
I will say it.
We don't exist.
I can imagine. Exactly. I'll make it real. I mean, the way I'm feeling these days. Yeah, indeed.
We're the
Yeah.
living dead.
The living dead. Yeah. Zombies. What can I do about this? And the heads go down.
Would drugs help?
I have a problem.
But it's
I'm not so
another way-
sure they're going to be our jobs.
But it's another way of a condition of slavery.
Well, of course it's
Even
a
in
condition.
Hegel's terms,
Yes.
right? The master-slave. We have
Right.
already lost that fight, and we're consigned to just...
Yes, you've lost
The
the
will of
fight
the
and
other.
you've interiorized the master so much to the point of complete submission.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You know. I told someone there are better sexual practices in the West Village, you know, that, you know, used to go, I mean, anyway, you know, than this kind of stuff. You know, you get more out of it than this kind of submission you're going through, you know.
At least there's aspects of the erotic. where-
Well, I mean, that's the problem. The problem.
This
No
is
one's
slavery without
no
the
one's
erotic.
talking about these kind of things anymore. You know, we're looking at the Me Too movement. You know, we're looking at all this stuff that's coming down, but none of it's really being analyzed psychoanalytically or through categories that have been very much in play. You know, up until 10, 15 years ago, before we went through this infantilization period of digital technologies and press buttons all the time. I was told by a psychoanalyst a couple of weeks ago that nobody dates except by apps anymore.
That's true.
Except by apps.
Yeah,
it's
she was
horrible.
asking me, how come, you know, she said, you know, how come you haven't found anybody? I said, you know why. I said, you know, you have to go out and meet people. Everybody's doing it online. You're right, everybody is on apps. 90% of the dating
You haven't
is by
tried the
apps.
apps.
No, I will not go there.
You have to have
I
a
will not go
profile.
there. I'm going to go.
Yeah.
I'm going to go.
Yeah.
I'm going to
You
go.
get
it.
Yeah.
You
I don't think my
you might have a
profile
lot
would
of
be.
dates.
No, I don't. Number one, I don't want a lot of dates, and number two, probably not the kind of dates I would get on the profile anyway. Kind of fun. Anyway, but this is very radical stuff. I mean, when you begin to think about it, I mean, it's radical conservative in the sense that the radicality is in, you know, in some ways the freedom, right, to grasp one's possibilities and move with them, right? That is a radical move, especially these days, to root oneself, etc., that it opens up this possibility. There's great anxiety in this, though. When you start saying, I can grasp, this is really possible, this is within reach, a lot of people, back off.
It's kind of
and
a
the
humble
left
work.
can really learn
it's not
from...
an arrogant work.
No, it's not
very
arrogant. He's not
humble.
arrogant.
It's very humble.
No, he arrogates. He's
Yeah.
not arrogant.
Not
Not in
because-
the sense
yeah.
we use it. He arrogates because he's very smart. I mean, to arrogate
kind of-
means you have something to really...
He's in awe of
Yes,
sort of the world.
yes,
you know?
yes, yes. No, I mean, it's an important thing for philosophy that you have to have that sense of wonder,
Yeah.
and the drive, to both see and hear. Yeah.
And it's true that the Marxists, like you said, the Marxist tradition, we did have this like split between the positivist leaning, Cartesian leaning kind
Right.
of currents in Marxist thought, which had dogmatic kind of interpretations.
Right.
And also the more creative, open-ended, which lost the fight, I guess.
Yes, it did
Like,
lose the
so
fight.
you-
It loses the fight in
the
all
West, yeah.
endeavors. It's lost the
Yeah.
fight in the art world.
Yeah.
Look at the crap that's out there today. I mean, to be honest with you, yeah. I mean, it's losing fights. The serious research is really losing the fight. It's the superficial research that can be turned into instant profit, etc. Technoscience is really a major enemy, in some ways. I mean, it has benefits. I'm not saying it's all, I don't want to be, totalizing about this, but in some ways it has become really a major part of the
It's extraordinary
the
that
enemy.
a technology that essentially digitizes filing cabinets, which is essentially what databases are,
Yes.
has become the hegemonic way through which everybody looks at the world. So like all these apps, they're basically databases that you can easily navigate through. Like you punch preferences, like you order this food, that food.
Right.
It's classified.
You see,
by
Rachel got
Chinese.
the reservation earlier than I did by calling the owner the old style.
Right.
I'm just
And
kidding.
a bottle of wine.
Yes,
Right.
yeah. No,
But the
they
database would
won't,
never
they won't
give you
give us a
access to
bottle
a
of
free
wine.
bottle of
They'll
wine.
give us maybe an after
Yeah.
dinner drink tonight. Yeah, yeah. So, let me just mention a couple of other things too. The interesting thing about attunement, I just wrote down a couple of the more important aspects. Attunement discloses Dasein in its thrownness, and initially, for the most part, in the mode of the evasive turning away. Right? You are disclosed more by evasion, or what Deleuze called the lines of flight, right, than you are in terms of taking responsibility. Attunement also measures, if you will, or at least shows the level of the disclosedness submission to world, right? So in some ways, submission is not a terrible word for Heidegger. It's not really about submission to others or authority or whatever. Submission is to world and to freedom in a certain way. One gives oneself over to freedom in order to let the things appear as they really are. Yeah, so this is another interesting part. Going back to this whole thing of the taking of responsibility or owning up to the possibilities, one thing the left has been unable to do when it begins to grasp taking something, it always shirks in the face of power. That's another thing. It cannot take power.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me. How it
Since
cannot
Mao.
take power.
Yeah.
Yeah, since Mao, or, yeah. I mean, there have been a few examples,
Yeah.
but yeah. I mean, I know how difficult it is in Grenada,
Since Nicaragua, yeah.
all these kind of places, given the youth. But in a way, just think how difficult it was for Mao.
That
I
long
mean,
march.
you seen some of those movies on
Kind of
Shanghai, some of that great Chinese cinema of that period?
Yeah.
About the yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable.
Well, just how many years were they on the long march?
24 years or something? Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he started in the 20s.
Yeah.
They didn't take power to 1949.
Right. But I mean, you know, just
And they survived the execution of most of the party.
Yes, most of
Well,
you
yeah,
talk
that
about
started-
this party, the parties in any of the United States, any of the radicals here, be finished. You know, they went through that kind of purge. We make big deals
They went
about
through
the
that kind of
Panthers,
purge, and then they
you know,
went on the long
the
march.
McCarthyism, etc. Give me a break. Compared to the Chinese, you know, yeah. Give me a
and
break.
then they ended up in a cave.
I mean, really.
He ended up in a cave in Yan'an.
Yes, that's right. Right.
No, I mean,
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
Wow.
No, I know. No, I'm you know, I've started to read a lot of their philosophy again. I'm rereading Mencius. I have an idea for an essay on since the Chinese bought the Greek port of Piraeus, essentially, I was
Yeah.
going to rewrite a Platonic dialogue between Socrates and Thrasymachus, the sophist who talks about power and justice.
Yeah,
So I was going to do the Chinese Thrasymachus. What? I'm sorry?
Dimitri Leskeas did an interesting interview with the head of the union at Piraeus.
Oh, the CGT?
Yeah,
They're on strike.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a general strike. Oh yeah, was he good? The guy was in Greek translated, or
No, he
spoke English.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
No, it's just interesting. you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
I
I'm
mean,
sure. Yeah, no, I know. They're in general strike.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they weren't at that moment.
Oh, okay. Well, they went on general strike this week, 3 days ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. The whole country. It's the 25th general strike in the last 4 years. Goes to show you how much power general strikes have. But they're right in so many respects. Actually, they're women that have led this one.
Oh,
You know,
okay.
they're actually the women's part-time. That they can't stand the part-time jobs. They cannot stay solvent.
Mm.
You know, and they hate the working part-time. Yeah, yeah. These are highly educated people just can't find jobs. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
That's here too.
Right. That's everywhere now.
Yeah.
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 Our union said we can't strike because it's not possible.
Who said this?
Our union last year. It's not possible, right? So the actual versus the possible.
Our
It's just not
buddy,
possible.
our buddy Tony will get you a great contract. I promise you that. Yeah, yeah. I'm
Did
not
he pay you
finished.
back?
I was going to go.
Oh.
No. I told him he's coming to my house. I'm making him come all the way to my house to pay me. Yeah. No, I'm serious.
I'm
Okay,
serious.
let me just yeah. No, I am. He called me. How you doing?
It was
Did you see? Yeah,
$28.
yeah. I told him. How come you didn't see Arto? You're avoiding Arto and Peter. $28 lunch. Adjunct professor at the MCC. Right? Yeah, the most expensive lunch.
Good lunch.
Yeah. So let me just quickly go over this, and then we'll pick up with the thing later. All right. So disclosing project. I think this is very interesting. Site of Dasein, page 142. I remember I gave you the three, elements there of Sicht, Umsicht, and Durchsicht, transparency. The taking care, circumspection. Do you remember this? I did this a little earlier. At the place on Broadway. We call the site, which is primary and as a whole related to existence, transparency. We choose this term to designate currently understood self-knowledge in order to indicate it is not a matter here of perceptually finding and gazing at a point which is the self, but of grasping and understanding the full disclosiveness of being in the world throughout all its essential constitutive factors. Existing beings glimpse themselves only when they have become transparent to themselves, equipped primordially in their being with the world, and being together with others as the constitutive factors of their existence. Okay? So this is an important little section. And then, conversely, so you see this nice play between transparency and opacity, right? The of Dasein is not solely and primarily rooted, and this is very interesting, in egocentric self-deceptions, but just as much in ignorance about the world. Here's your Trump right here. Right? Yeah. We must, of course, guard against the misunderstanding of the expression sight. It corresponds to the clearness of Gelichtheit, characterizing the disclosedness of the there. Seeing not only does not mean perceiving with the bodily eyes, neither does it mean the mere non-sensory perception of something objectively present in its objective presence. The only peculiarity of seeing, which we claim for the existential meaning of sight, is the fact that it lets beings accessible to it be encountered in themselves without being concealed. Of course, every sense does this within its genuine realm of discovery, but the tradition of philosophy has been primarily oriented from the very beginning towards seeing as the mode of access into being. That's Plato, that's the eidos, the eidetic, the whole history of Western philosophy privileges seeing. Yeah? Seeing the forms. Yeah? Yeah. Issuing of the forms. Okay? To preserve this connection, one can formalize sight and seeing to the point of establishing a universal term which characterizes every access as access whatsoever to beings and to being. By showing how all sight is primarily based on understanding, the circumspection of taking care is understanding as comprehension. This is what comprehension really means for him. Circumspection of taking care, right? As comprehension. People really learn if they're taking care. I mean, this is really, I think, a condition of learning. You really need a structure of care. It's not that just someone's gifted to absorb, in the environment. It's really about the care and the taking care in terms of real comprehension. Yep. Yep. We have taken away from mere intuition its priority, which noetically corresponds to the traditional ontological priority of objective presence. Intuition and thought are already remote derivatives of understanding. And this is interesting, too, because we talk about thinking and we talk about intuition, but they're derivative from understanding. Even the phenomenological, and this is Husserl, the Wesenschauen, intuition of essence, is based on an existential understanding. We can decide about this kind of seeing only when we obtain the explicit concepts of being, the structure of being, which only phenomena in the phenomenological sense can become. They're very important, the section here on the art of seeing phenomenologically, the art of understanding, and that intuition and thought are derivatives of the understanding. Okay, so the understanding is very crucial here. Dasein as understanding. Mm-hmm. Okay, let me go on a couple of more and then we'll close for today. All right, the page 143, understanding and interpretation. The ontic explicitness of as, the force structure, page 145, last sentence of the first paragraph there. The as does not first show in a statement, but is only first stated, which is possible only because it is there as something to be stated. The fact that the explicitness of a statement can be lacking in simple looking does not justify us in denying every articulate interpretation, and thus the as structure to this simple seeing. The simple seeing of things nearest to us as our having to do with contains the structure of interpretation so primordially that a grasping of something which, so to speak, free of the as requires a kind of reorientation. When we just stare at something, our just having it before us lies before us as a failure to understand it anymore. Of course, you can do the subway thing, what you're looking at. You can say, oh, it's a failure to understand, right, lying before us. This grasping, which is free of the as a privation of simple seeing, which understands it is not more primordial than the latter, but derived from it. The ontic inexplicitness of the as must not mislead us into overlooking it as the a priori existential condition of understanding. So you have this force structure of as, the role as, right? Something as, Heidegger as philosopher, Derrida as philosopher. You know, all of these things become very crucial as we go forward. And this becomes part of the role that the language of as plays.
Future has passed.
Future has passed, and also the law of analogy. You begin to see all kinds of things within the history of philosophy. The rule of simile, right? Metaphorics. All of this stuff is happening now in terms of this understanding. This is a very dense section. I mean, when I send out the email, we'll, you know, I mean, obviously we're not going to get to all of this section on language. We'll pick up language and care for next time. But let's do about 5 more minutes, and then we can go. Let me just make so it goes through foresight, approaching, foreseen in the next section, and then if you look at 146. The interpretation of something as something essentially grounded in forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. Interpretation is never a presuppositionalist grasping of something previously given. When a specific instance of interpretation, as in the sense of a precise textual interpretation, appeals to what is there, then that which is initially is there is nothing other than the self-evident, undisputed, or undiscussed prejudice of the interpreter, which necessarily lies in every interpreted approach as that which is already positive with interpretation in general, namely, that which is pre-given in forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. You can usually know a good teacher by knowing their forehaving, their foresight, and their foreconception. It's usually a good test. This is the way evaluation should really be done. But they're not gonna, they're not gonna change this either. Yeah. So how do we conceive the character of the four? All right. Well, we'll leave with the four after we go through this. Have we done this when we formally say a priori? Why is this structure appropriate to understanding? How we characterize this? And he goes on about the as structure, for which the preparation up to this point, before answering all these questions, our preparation's not good enough, Heidegger says, right? So in the projecting of understanding, beings are disclosed in their possibility. The character of possibility always corresponds to the kind of being of the beings understood. Inner-worldly beings in general are projected upon the world, that is, upon a totality of significance in whose referential relations, taking care as being in the world, has rooted itself from the beginning. When inner-worldly beings are discovered along with the being of Dasein, that is, when they become intelligible, we say they have meaning. But strictly speaking, what is understood, not the meaning, but beings or being. Meaning is that wherein, and this is a definition of meaning, wherein the intelligibility of something maintains itself. That which can be articulated in disclosure that understands we call meaning. Okay? The concept of meaning includes the formal framework of what necessarily belongs to what interpretation that articulates. Meaning structured by forehaving, foresight, and foreconception is the upon which of the project in terms of which something becomes intelligible as something. Okay? These are good definitions of meaning. I mean, this is very dense when you really begin to think about it. Every meaning is structured by forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. Right? Yeah. You want to talk about meaning of life? Very difficult. Right? When you start here, right? Insofar as understanding and interpretation constitute the existential constitution of the being of their meaning must be conceived as the formal existential framework of the disclosedness belonging to understanding. Meaning is an existential of design, not a property. You don't learn meaning from dictionaries. Right? Not a property that is attached to beings, which lies behind them or floats somewhere as a realm between, another aspect. Only Dasein has meaning, and the disclosiveness of being in the world can be fulfilled through the being's discoverable in it. Thus, only design can be meaningful or meaningless. This means its own being and the beings disclosed with that being can be appropriated in an understanding, or they can be confined to an understanding or incomprehensibility. So why don't we, it's fundamental, ontological, existential. If we adhere to that, all beings whose mode of being is unlike design must be understood as unmeaningful, is essentially bare of meaning. But unmeaningful does not mean here a value judgment, but expresses an ontological determination. So meaning, ontological meaning is what he's going for here, not ontic variations or ontic disclosiveness. Right? Only what is unmeaningful can be absurd. Objectively, present things encountered can, so to speak, assault its being, for example, events of nature which break in us on and destroy us. Okay? So then he's going to go back, and why don't we leave it here? This is one of his fundamental questions, the meaning of being, right? So both meaning and now what is the, one of the essential questions he asks in the beginning of the book, what is the meaning of being, is going to be engaged for the first time here to a degree, right? Through language.
Page
To a
147.
degree. He very carefully got
Initial
it. I'm
discussion.
sorry, yeah. You guys asked for it.
It's a totally
Anyway.
different way of thinking. Like,
Pretty amazing,
Page
yeah.
140 is the
yeah.
initial attempt at answering their fundamental question.
Well, he still doesn't answer it here.
Right.
This is really
Just the
about
initial-
understand the relationship between the existential ontological understanding and the question of the meaning of being. All right, good. All right.
Amazing.
So there's a bathroom right across the hall. It does mean something. To biology, at least. Yeah.